Chapter 75. It had to be said that Luo, who was also a rank 2 Ascended Naga, had a really weak sword technique. Although he had undergone systematic training, when he went out to kill people, he still relied on his extraordinary strength and defensive ability. Occasionally, he would use his soul ability to trick people, but his real skills could only be said to be passable. It looked like it. After going through Crow's dark training camp, Huaisher felt that it was simply a mess. In his remaining records, there was nothing useful to write about. In the broken records, there was a lot of killing people and a lot of collecting money. His memory of many combat skills had gradually become blurry and rusty, showing fragmentation. On the other hand, he remembered his anonymous account in the United American Bank very well. Unfortunately, Ascenders earn a lot, but they also spend a lot. Just the 4 machetes made by the Alchemy Workshop cost tens of millions. This kind of cold weapon that could be used in the present and the border was really worth every penny. To be able to fight so many times with the sacrificial knife, a relic from the border that could cut iron like mud, and only break when Huaisher cheated with his soul ability, it could only be said that the quality was excellent. The cost of alchemy potions was even more exaggerated. A tube of silver blood potion, equivalent to a small red bottle, had a market price of 900,000 yuan. Even if the unit price was relatively not too expensive, over a long period of time, it would accumulate to a particularly frightening amount of expenditure. And this thing was just a necessity. If you went out without a red bottle, how would you fight with your head? Not to mention, there was also the existence of the Burmese religion that monopolized the poison dragon stigmata, the Theravada Tantra. Wanting to buy special custom-made potions and materials for advancement was simply equivalent to sending money to be robbed. Even if he broke the law and made a lot of money by smuggling, he spent it all in the blink of an eye. He only left about 7 million yuan in funds, which was sneered at by Crow. Pauper. Huaisher could only think about it in horror. After calculating, what he ate and drank at Crow's place added up to more than a few million yuan, right? He had inquired about it. Although the supplements on the market were relatively cheap, they only referred to those ordinary nutritional products. If it came with special strengthening, one bottle, and at least 1 million yuan. Who didn't want a healthy body? Who wouldn't want to lay a good foundation for the future while they were still developing? Now, it seemed that the price she gave him was no longer a friendship price. It was practically a father's price. It was almost as if she was giving it away for free. He had to admit that it was quite satisfying to have such an exaggerated golden thigh to hug from time to time. As for her occasional unreliability and nonsense, humans always have their strengths and weaknesses, not to mention Crow. In short, after going through Luo's records, in addition to knowing a few materials needed for the Naga's Sacred Mark formula, the biggest gain was this set of Theravada Tantric dual blade technique. Although the group of Baldies were very aggressive in collecting money, at least they were willing to give it to Luo. They didn't hide anything when they were teaching Luo. Unfortunately, Luo did not have any talent in using dual swords, not to mention that Naga was using 4 swords. The more complicated it was, the more he could only see the basics. The Theravada Tantras were not so considerate that they would pester you to teach you if you were not interested. Anyway, the past had already said that it was up to you whether you could learn it or not. You find it troublesome to use 4 arms, and the higher level Naga's Sacred Mark is 6 arms. If you can't learn it, it can only mean that you are not fated to learn it. Don't force it, just recharge it. In the end, it was Huaisher who benefited. Dual blade technique was good, so cool. It was just that it was a bit troublesome to use after being beaten by the instructor for the 6th time. Huaisher was flustered and exasperated. He waved his hand to call for a rope and directly tied the instructor up to use as a human dummy. Anyway, it could be restarted even if he was chopped to death. You just have to suffer a little first. In the gradual trial and practice, the dual blades in Huaisher's hands were also constantly changing. Although it was still in the shape of a scimitar, the center of gravity and arc gradually became the same as the 2 scimitars in Luo's hands. It was not until he gradually understood the mystery that Huaisher believed in the existence of 4 and 6 swords. In the end, The core of this set of Theravada Tantric dual blade technique was to move according to the momentum. Whether it was 2 arms, 4 arms, or even 8 arms, it didn't matter. The main point was to find the flaws and fill in the gaps. It was actually a set of underwater combat methods, and the fighting style was as if it was underwater. This was the home field of the Nagas. Since it was a technique that originated from the water, it was naturally impossible to split Mount Hua at the slightest movement. Otherwise, under the resistance of the water, it would only be half the result with twice the effort. What it pursued was a dense and continuous attack, a soft force technique that neutralized and hit, and an extremely deceptive feint. Once it was fully displayed, there would be no gap or breathing room before the enemy died. Once it was defended, it could be said to be airtight. The focus of its attack was not the action of slashing, but the process of pulling the blade back after it was close to the enemy's body. It was like a saw. The sharp teeth on the blade would tear a huge gap in the enemy's body, and the Naga's poison would invade, ravaging the enemy to death bit by bit. And, through a special throwing technique, it could also achieve the effect of a flying tool through the rotation of the center of gravity of the scimitar. When used by a real expert, they would be as agile as a sea snake. At that time, the more scimitars there were, the more terrifying the lethality would be. The terrifying thing about this set of dual saber techniques was not its direct lethality, but its impenetrable defense and pervasive attacks that brought enormous psychological pressure to the enemy. Then, the enemy would be hollowed out from the inside bit by bit. It was extremely sinister. As for Heluo's big moves that took the wrong path from the beginning, the teachers could only say, "No wisdom, next." After killing dozens of instructors to practice, Huaisha finally got a glimpse of the door. The level of the Theravada dual blade technique in the Book of Destiny had also reached LV4. After having the foundation of Roman dagger fighting, he learned everything quickly. Unlike the simple military fighting that pursued the greatest lethality, this set of dual blade techniques was unexpectedly fun to play with, and he could play a lot of tricks. It was a pity that Heluo's blade was left at the scene, and it was most likely surnamed by now. He was a sinner, so he shouldn't think too much and just obediently play with the Book of Destiny. Killing instructors was really fun. He was completely addicted to it. Even after finishing the record for the umpteenth time, he still couldn't help but open the Book of Destiny again. I'll cut one more, just one more. On the other side, in the Stone Marrow Hall, Crow's stigmata forging had reached the most critical moment. Under the gloomy light, the melted metal in the crucible did not emit the slightest bit of light. Instead, it was like a black hole that constantly pulled the surrounding light, like a crack that led to the abyss. With the addition of materials such as rainbow gold, the Silent One's proof, iron frost silver, and so on, it began to emit gusts of cold wind, rolling up a black fog and shrouding the entire basement in a gloomy fog. Now, everything was ready, and only one thing was missing. Crow stood in front of the crucible, looked back at the mournful sacrificial blade on the table, and gently urged, "The time has come. Do you want to jump in yourself? Or do you want me to help you?" The sacrificial blade shook violently and screamed. It seemed that it would rather die than submit. After Crow urged it again and again, it jumped out of the scabbard and tried to slash at Crow. After absorbing a lot of blood and life, the sacrificial blade at this moment was overflowing with golden light. It was incomparably gorgeous, and the blade was inlaid with various fine gemstones and strange runes. Now that it was out of the scabbard, the sharp killing intent in the entire room dispersed the cold wind and rain. The condensed death aura followed the blade and slashed at Crow. Then, there was no then. Crow looked up at it, and then it fell on the table in an instant, lost all its power, and wailed. "You got guts." Crow sneered. "Back then, even Sepetitek didn't dare to be presumptuous in front of me. You're just a shoddy imitation of the Skinner. Where did your courage come from?" He didn't care at all about the tyrannical god that the Aztecs worshipped back then, and gave an arrogant evaluation with disdain. "Well, you refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit, right? Come, let Sister have a good look at you. Is your development normal?" She raised her slender claws and dug out the gemstones that were condensed from origin substance one by one, throwing them into the boiling metal in the crucible. Amidst Blade's shrill cries, all the gems were completely stripped. Even the golden patches were torn off, leaving nothing behind. In the end, she even disintegrated the hilt of the blade, leaving only the gray blade making a weeping sound. Now you agree? Too late. Crow sneered. A trashy, scheming bitch like you wants to be my little Huaishur stigmata? Dream on. If sister doesn't tear you apart today, my surname isn't Wu. After ignoring the fact that her surname wasn't Wu, she gently pecked at the blade with her beak, pulling out a shrieking shadow from the blade. She opened her mouth and swallowed it into her stomach. Then, she let out a happy burp. Beneath the feathers, a layer of faintly discernible gold also appeared on her current main body, the branches of her body. It was a great supplement. Unfortunately, the amount was still a bit too little. She smacked her lips in pity, flapped her wings, and an invisible force directly threw the blade into the crucible. Compared to the length of the blade, the crucible's depth was surprisingly shallow, but it actually swallowed it all at once. It was hard to imagine whether the blade had melted like butter in that instant, or if it had really fallen into the dark crack that led to somewhere. Then, a boiling sound rang out. The darkness was surging. From the surging darkness, there seemed to be substances slowly gathering. They relied on the metal liquid, slowly condensing, and a bright and clean appearance appeared. With the remains of the sacrificial blade as the main body, after integrating many materials, the miracle of the abyss finally emerged from Crow's cauldron. It revealed its appearance. It was hard to tell whether it was a gorgeous dagger or the key to a treasury door. Jagged teeth gathered on the spine of the blade, and a brilliant golden glow emerged from the teeth that extended out. On its hilt, there was a hexagonal gemstone that was almost pure black. Crow raised her head and glanced at it, saying, "Let there be light." Then, a flame ignited in the hexagonal gemstone, and so the matter was settled. Chapter 76. Today's update is over. Sob. I feel like I'm going to collapse. My neck hurts like hell. Can everyone please subscribe again? If I can break 3,000 subscriptions in 24 hours tomorrow, I'll try again. Life in prison was very comfortable. There was no prison drama as imagined. In fact, there were only 2 or 3 people in the large detention room. Usually, even if they were released, they wouldn't meet each other. Everyone wanted to exchange their experiences in prison escape, but there was no place to start. His friends in the Special Affairs Department also took good care of him. It seemed that after hearing the strange story of him killing a person in 10 steps, they had a strange respect and admiration for him. Moreover, Huaishur never put on airs when they met, so most of them were familiar with him. Now that he was in prison, although they couldn't let him go because of their duty, they generally turned a blind eye to anything that wasn't too much. Moreover, Huaishur was very cooperative and didn't cause any trouble for everyone. After he got his cello, he found someone to get back his music player from the evidence department. From then on, he lived a fulfilling life of listening to music, waking up early to practice his cello, and practicing his swordsmanship before bed. Looking at it this way, it seemed to be no different from the closed training before the comprehensive exam. He had already left school, but he didn't expect the training life to catch up with him. It can only be said that life was really full of ups and downs, and it was really unpredictable. As a result, on the 3rd day, when he was practicing his cello as usual, he heard an unexpected sound. "Hey, buddy," the isolated prisoner asked. "Do you know Rabuk?" Huaishur raised his eyebrows. "You know Rabuk? How rare." The person next door was amused. "I'm more or less a graduate of the Ivy League in America. How can I not know Rabuk?" "Okay." Huaishur nodded happily. "Which one do you like the unaccompanied cello suite?" "It doesn't matter which capital it is." The dispirited young man leaned against the wall and whispered softly, "I just want to hear some sound. Anything is fine." Huaishur thought for a while, then pushed his hair, which was gradually getting in the way, to the back of his head. He picked up the bow, thought for a moment, and pulled the strings. Bach unaccompanied cello suite, overture. When Huaishur combined piano practice and meditation, His skills and music seemed to have undergone a qualitative change. Not only his own performance ability, but the influence of the music was also frighteningly strong. Soon, a gentle melody flowed out from the strings. The invisible sound spread in the air, filling every inch of this cold cage. As a result, everything seemed to soften. There was no harm. Under the morning sun, dust flew in the air. Everything was as beautiful as a dream. Even the patrolling guards stopped and quietly listened to the sound of the zither behind the cage, not far away. They were immersed in the gentle melody, and the corners of their mouths curled up. 2 minutes passed in the blink of an eye. What followed was a long silence. After a long time, Huaisher heard a hoarse sigh coming from next door. "That's great." As if satisfied, the young man said sincerely, "Thank you." Huaisher hesitated for a long time before finally asking, Do you know that I killed your father?" Then, he heard Qi Yuan's choking laughter. "You don't have to worry," he said. "I knew that from the first day." "You don't hate him?" "Would you believe me if I said I don't hate him?" Qi Yuan said, "Don't worry, I hate him more than I hate you." Qi Yuan suddenly laughed. "Do you know what it's like to live in a transparent cage and be treated as a model display from a young age?" Huaisher thought for a moment and couldn't help but nod. "It sounds very enviable." "Yes, you don't have to worry about food and clothing, and you don't have to worry about anything. Except for the fact that you can't find a place to hide under the flash. It's perfect. Since I was young, even if I made a small mistake, Chiwen would look at me with a gaze that said he should have thrown me out on the street like a stray dog." Qi Yuan sneered. "He didn't treat me as a son at all. In his eyes, it was a mistake for me to come into this world." That's not true, right? At first, I just thought he was strict with me. I tried my best to prove my ability to him. That was until he told me that I was my mother's illegitimate child." As if he was telling someone else's story, Qi Yuan's tone was almost cold. He was afraid that others would laugh at him for being cuckolded. After getting rid of my mother, he raised me as if nothing had happened, like raising a dog. Huaisher didn't know what to say, but Qi Yuan seemed to be interested and asked mockingly, "You should have seen the illegitimate child he had outside, right? That he Luo should have been killed by you, right? That's his real heir." "Ha ha, how was that old guy's expression at that time? Wasn't it very exciting?" The situation in your family is really complicated, isn't it?" Qi Yuan seemed to be talking to himself. "It's the same for everyone, right? There's always something that makes people unhappy." Huaisher didn't answer. "Actually, I should thank you. If it weren't for you, I would have gone crazy now, right?" Qi Yuan's voice was hoarse. "I wanted to kill him. I tried everything I could think of, but I didn't even know how to hold a knife. In the end, I was completely regarded as a joke." Huaisher shook his head. "I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. You don't have to answer. I just want to find someone to talk to. I'm sorry to disturb you. Please continue to play the zither." Qi Yuan leaned against the wall and whispered softly as if he was begging, "Let me listen to the zither." "Okay." The zither sounded again. Qi Yuan didn't say anything after that. In the fear, panic, and despair that haunted him these days, he finally fell asleep peacefully. Snoring sounded. Inside the prison, Huaisher played the zither leisurely. He had no idea that the world outside the prison had been turned upside down. With AI Qing's push, Division Chief Fu, who had been stable for more than 10 years, slammed the table and went to his superiors. It was unclear whether he had been provoked too much by Huaisher, but he actually slammed the table and went to his superiors to force the approval of the temporary control plan in Exine High. Then, he started a thorough screening of the whole city. From inside to outside, he wanted to dig out the group of lunatics who were the purified citizens one by one. In just a few days, the results were great. The macho brothers of the suppression unit had taken down several nests. Even though they suffered some losses, they still managed to kill several of the ranch owner's sublimators on the spot. At this point, the mighty operation to eliminate evil had finally reached its climax. Under the command of AI Qing, through the pursuit and search at all costs, the battle that had lasted for 3 days had entered its final stage. The sublimators brought with them all kinds of weapons, and they had completely surrounded the dilapidated building in the old city, the Dragon Horse Plaza. the last headquarters of the Salvation Society in Exine High. After coldly ignoring all the demands of the other party for negotiation, Division Chief Fu was determined to finish the job in one fell swoop. The results of the search over the past few days had made him unable to sleep well for the past few days. This group of B** stards had not only scammed the old people's pensions and created a cult that could not be seen in public, but they had also used the influence of the parents to secretly reach into the schools in the city. There were 2 schools where even the leaders and teachers had become believers. This caused Division Chief Fu to explode on the spot. Trash. You are all trash. Normally, all you care about is eating and using your credit card. You have taken a lot of money, but now you only know how to mess things up. Thinking about how his precious daughter had been led astray by this group of lunatics, he wanted to hang the leaders one by one in front of the school gate. Negotiation? What kind of negotiation is that? Division Chief Fu held the phone and laughed at the tone of the other party. Let's talk about whether all of you will be sent to the border for an indefinite period of reform or be executed by firing squad for 10 minutes. You are still dreaming when you are about to die. What kind of wishful thinking is this? He violently hung up the phone and sat down on the chair in the temporary frontline command center. He pointed at his subordinates one by one. Do it. Do you hear me? Even if you can't kill them, do it. Set up the things in the warehouse one by one. I don't want this year's budget, but I want to kill these scourges here. Do you understand? Therefore, rockets, howitzers, machine guns, and even a few tanks started to be deployed amidst the rumbling sound. If Huaisher knew that the heavy firepower of the Special Affairs Division was stored in the military base outside the city, he would definitely regret it. If he could have stolen some rocket launchers, he would not have had to go through so much trouble. Ai Qing watched everything calmly. Now that Division Chief Fu was there, she did not need to give any orders. She was too lazy to care about these things. As a local member of the Astronomy Society, her responsibility was not to do these things. Instead, she was responsible for monitoring the entire operation and ensuring that this force was used correctly to surround the Exine High base. Sign your name while you're at it. She did not need to wait for long before the door of the carriage was opened. The supporters who came from afar finally caught up with the final battle. One of them was a burly middle-aged man with stubble. He wore a loose military uniform. Under his rolled-up sleeves, the muscles on his arms bulged when he swung his arms. She could vaguely see pieces of burn scars. The other one wore rimless glasses and looked refined. His white shirt was spotless, and he held a suit in his hand. After saluting and greeting Division Chief Fu, the 2 of them showed their Social Security Bureau IDs to Ai Qing. The silent, burly man did not speak, but the skinny man with the rimless glasses introduced them. Hello, Madam Ai Qing. According to the orders of our superiors, we are here to provide support. This is Level 3 Sublimator Jinmu. I am Level 3 Sublimator Shinyu. We are carrying a border relic. If it's convenient for you to move, please sign your name here. It seemed that Shanyu is already used to dealing with inspectors. In order to avoid trouble and disputes, Shinyu directly took out the transfer orders and operation order from the folder and handed them to Ai Qing. Of course, she took out a pen and signed her name on the operation permit, confirming the legitimacy of the 2's next actions. Then, her mission was half completed. The 2 supporters looked at each other and felt that they had met an inspector who was easy to talk to. They seemed to have relaxed a little. Chapter 77. They had to be serious about this kind of thing. After all, protecting the Discovery Realm was not like treating someone to a meal. Since it was a military operation, there was naturally the possibility of innocent people being involved. This included the possibility of the returned people holding civilians hostage or other accidents. Sometimes, there would be some very difficult situations to deal with. Therefore, before this, someone needed to vouch for the legitimacy of the operation. Even if there was an accident that caused a mistake or caused damage outside the scope of the operation, as long as it wasn't too excessive or they weren't caught by the inspector, the 2 of them would naturally be exempted from all criminal responsibility and other troublesome matters. In order to avoid accidents or irreparable losses, and at the same time, to give the frontline sublimators the right to act at their own discretion. This kind of bureaucratic procedure had to be followed. Everyone was used to it. However, some inspectors would often make things difficult for them in order to show their authority or avoid responsibility. The more stubborn ones would simply refuse to sign or wait until the end of the operation to give them face and sign. After AI Ching signed the document, the two felt a lot more at ease. After handing the document to Director Fu for safekeeping, they sat down and began to understand the situation. The Dragon Horse building was more than 40 meters tall, which was similar to the area of an ordinary shopping mall. The original construction plan was to have 10 floors. The bottom 5 floors would be used as a shopping mall, and the top 5 floors would be used as the most luxurious hotel in the city. However, only 4 of the 5 floors were built, and the investors ran out of money. Since then, the project was scrapped. And now, under the secret operations of the Savior Society, this place had become the nest of the returned people. There were more than 40 members hiding inside, and according to speculation, there were many mutants that they had raised over the years. It was a tough bone to chew. However, now that Jinling had support, the situation was a little easier. At least they would not be helpless when they opened the fast circle to pollute the Discovery Realm. Not to mention, they had military-level firepower. Even though they were limited by the city and couldn't call a long sword to clean the ground, the lethality was still amazing. Now that they had surrounded the people, the reason why they didn't move was to minimize losses to the greatest extent. Now that Jinling's support had arrived, the next move was much more convenient. After confirming that there was no possibility for them to escape, the 2 sublimators, who had just arrived and hadn't rested for a while, said that they didn't need to rest anymore. They had to act as soon as possible. Jimu had the military style in his bones, while Shinyu had the persistence of efficiency in time. The sooner the better. A long delay may lead to trouble. Shinyu looked at her watch and said, "If we can make it, we can go support other places." Okay. After learning about their soul power through the reports, Director Fu thought for a moment, and he picked up the walkie-talkie. Action. Then there was a roar. 10 minutes ago, the deepest part of the Longma building had now turned into a dark, fasting circle. In the center, there was a huge bronze mirror. The mirror was extremely smooth, but it didn't reflect the outside world at all. Instead, it was completely dark. In the endless darkness, one could vaguely see a twisted and huge shadow sitting in the deepest part. Its huge wings seemed to cover the sky and the sun, and all the shadows were intimidated. And on the body that looked like a beast, there were as many as 9 hideous heads. Even though it was difficult to see their faces through the layers of darkness, it was enough to feel the pairs of scarlet eyes in the darkness, overlooking everything in the world. Just in front of the huge bronze mirror, 7 people who came from afar respectfully prostrated on the ground. Following the call of the Lord, Tong Lu Association has come to see you. Spiritual Doctor Association has come to see you. Celestial Treasure Association has come to see you. Hongshi Rinji Association has come to see you. At this moment, in the cities around Xinhai, all the heads of the subordinate organizations of the pure people had gathered here. They brought all their reserves and treasures. The huge shadow in the bronze mirror let out a shrill laugh, and the steel in front of the mirror was twisted into pieces. Then get ready, everyone. I will give you the delicacies from the abyss. The huge shadow in the darkness announced solemnly. Soon, according to the revelation of the Holy God, the lid of the hell cauldron will be opened again. In an instant, the darkness swallowed everything. The first to make a loud noise was the mortar in the surrounding area. After violently evacuating all the irrelevant people within a 1-kilometer radius, this place had turned into a real battlefield. After all, they were facing a threat at the border. If they didn't show the determination and confidence to fight a modern war, the result would be unpredictable. The sublimated suppression force of the Special Affairs Department had long been used to this. At this moment, once Director Fu gave the order, the huge war machine slowly started to move. Thus, a huge siege in the city began. The artillery roared. In an instant, a huge firepower that was enough to raise dozens of dragon horse buildings to the ground fell from the sky. But when it flew dozens of meters around the dragon horse building, its speed suddenly slowed down. A semicircular cover could vaguely be seen above the dragon horse building. The expanded fasting circle had gradually increased the depth of the reality. After crossing the border's safe depth, the space of the entire building was twisted toward the blessed land. The continuous bombardment of the cannons was delayed, and some of the explosions were unable to destroy the thin layer of the shield. But the fasting circle also began to shake. It was difficult to resist, but it was still stubborn. This was the most troublesome part of the territory outside the border. Among the three major blockades in the present realm, if one of them, the Bifrost, had the most common function of transferring a large amount of manpower at any time for emergency rescue, then the second blockade would be the largest place in the present realm and the support of all ordinary people. The colossal arcanum, known as Thus Spoke Zarathustra, was hailed as a great arcanum that cut off all arcanum. Its main function was to create a stable environment and physical laws around the present, allowing all permitted forces to operate effectively everywhere. After hundreds of years, under the addition of countless scholars and creators, its rules had now completely replaced the old world's set of unstable magic systems that relied on divine grace. It was replaced by a new world created by the first creator in history, Newton, and subsequent scholars. It covered all the fields of today's human beings, established the foundation of mechanics, finalized the balance of thermodynamics, propped up electromagnetism, and even developed into the profound fields of relativity and quantum mechanics. And among them, it included all kinds of firearms that everyone was accustomed to. Whether it was gunpowder power or electromagnetic power, it was enough to cause devastating damage to the fragile human body. Under the shroud of Zarathustra's secret instrument, all the ascendants who wanted to cause trouble had to weigh how long they could last in front of the unlimited production of guns and cannons. And once they reached the border where the reality's interference was thin, the power of these modern weapons would be rapidly weakened. Only the spiritualized weapons carefully created by alchemists, the precious weapons and weapon prototypes that had been circulating in the reality for decades, and the relics of the border could be used smoothly in hell. But now, such artillery bombardment was undoubtedly effective. Every explosion and impact was the power of the reality. Zarathustra's suppression of the fasting circle was like a bubble being ravaged by an undercurrent in the deep sea. In the reality, it was impossible for it to withstand attacks without an upper limit. There must be a critical value. And now, with Jinmu's appearance, this critical value was gradually facing collapse. After the burly man jumped out of the car, he took out the relics of the border sealed in a huge iron box from his car. It was hard to tell whether it was a long staff or an overly large iron whip. Its length alone was exaggerated to more than 3 meters, close to 4 meters. It was like an antique, covered with rust and traces of time. The surface of the giant bronze iron whip was octagonal, and the turning point had been rubbed until it glowed. Its weight alone reached hundreds of pounds. It was hard to imagine what kind of giant could create such an exaggerated weapon. If it wasn't for Jinmu's unreasonably muscular body, it was hard to know who else could grab the handle and lift it up. It was a genuine iron whip that was 2 feet long. Against the constantly erupting airwaves and strong winds, Jinmu casually took off the somewhat cumbersome military uniform on his body, revealing the strong muscles on his upper body, as well as the burn scars on his upper body. Shunyu, who was assisting at the back, seemed to be happy to explain. She explained to Director Fu and AI Ching. Jinmu was a firefighter before he ascended. It is said that his achievements are remarkable, and his strength is terrifying. It's just right for him to use this relic. If it were an actuary like me, I wouldn't be able to use it at all. But I don't have the courage to shout out that inexplicable activation code. While moving forward, Jinmu roared loudly. The muscles all over his body trembled, and his height increased by another 2 feet. The stigmata sleeping in his body was awakened. The third-level metal-type stigmata in the Eastern Xia lineage, Air Lai. It was a complete physical enhancement type. His entire body seemed to have turned into metal in an instant, and his weight increased by dozens of times. He left one footprint after another on the broken asphalt road. Finally, he walked out of the fasting circle, clenched the iron whip in his hands, and slowly swung it behind his back. He took a deep breath and roared loudly. "Did Sue Air update today?" Jean Moo's inexplicable words echoed in the air. Before they could disperse, the iron whip lit up with a blazing light, as if it was burning red. As Jean Moo swung it horizontally, it smashed into the fasting circle. In an instant, there was a roar. The fasting circle shook violently and wailed. What was wrapped in the iron whip was not only a terrifying power that was enough to smash a military fortress with one blow, but also the impact of the laws of the present realm on the border forces. Although the strange iron whip had to shout out inexplicable words when it was used, it was indeed a powerful weapon against the border regions. Jean Moo took a step back, took a deep breath again, and roared loudly. "Did Sue Air update today?" Boom! The fasting circle shook violently again, and huge cracks appeared. As Jean Moo roared again, the iron whip smashed down, and the fasting circle shattered. Countless artillery fire roared and swallowed the entire Dragon Horse building. Thanks to everyone's help, I have achieved a good result. Although it did not exceed 3,000, it is much better than I expected. Thank you very much. And I also recommend His Majesty's new book, You're a Genius. Chapter 78. Using this kind of border relic continuously required a huge amount of energy and origin substance. Even a level 3 stigmata Air Lai, who was regarded as a fighting machine, couldn't support such consumption. Perhaps only Xing En, who had advanced to the 4th stage, could use it freely after transforming Air Lai into a Phylian. Jean Moo panted tiredly for a long time before regaining his strength. Now, with the destruction of the fasting circle, the first line of sublimators had begun to fight with the border mutants released by the purified people. Accompanied by a violent roar, the earth shook. An extreme ape with a huge lizard head broke through the door of the Dragon Horse building and rushed toward the army outside the building. The bullets that hit its body were melted by the layer of raging fire that enveloped its body. In the blink of an eye, it leaped with all its might and tore apart a tank. It roared into the sky and waved the wreckage around, breaking the encirclement formation and giving the mutants behind it more room to attack. Jean Moo, do you still have energy? Director Fu asked through the communication device. Jean Moo grinned. This level of flame is a piece of cake. He carried the iron whip on his shoulder and leaped with all his might. Jean Moo rose into the air and smashed down on the dragon-headed fire ape. The fire ape suddenly turned around and glared at him with wide eyes. It opened its mouth and spat out a white flame. Everything around him turned yellow due to the sudden and terrifying heat. Even breathing would burn his lungs. The temperature of the core of the flame was enough to melt steel instantly. Jean Moo's expression didn't change. His smile widened as he stretched out a palm toward the fire ape and pressed down on the air. In an instant, all the flames dissipated and were replaced by a terrifyingly low temperature. How terrifying the heat was in the past was how cruel the low temperature was now. Jean Moo, who had risked his life as a firefighter in the past, awakened his soul in the face of fire. Reflecting the greatest desire in the depths of his soul, he was given the power to suppress all flames and heat by the Silver Ocean. Unfortunately, after that miraculous rescue, he had no choice but to leave the firefighting post that he loved and devote himself to the battle at the border. However, this icy iron will that could destroy everything had never melted in the slightest. And the name of this power was, remove all fire poison from the world. Sewer, did you stop playing mobile games today? As if passing through the residual heat of the flames, he roared loudly, raised the iron whip in his hand, and swung it down with all his might. However, the fire ape was caught off guard. Its entire head was covered in frost, and it stiffened for a moment. In the next second, the two crossed each other. The fire ape's head fell apart, leaving only half of it on its neck. Even its shoulder was broken by the whip. Its arm flew up, but before it fell to the ground, it froze into ice cubes and shattered into ice crystals on the ground. "Bastard, come again!" He turned around and roared at the fire ape that was still alive. It was rare for him to be in high spirits. "It's time for me to go on stage, too. Next, I'll have to ask the two of you to strengthen the defense of the command center to prevent the enemy from using the decapitation tactic." In the end, Shunyu still nagged a little because she was worried. Regarding this, Director Fu and AI Ching did not take it to heart. After all, when the two ascendants entered the battlefield, the defense of this place became much weaker. With Shunyu entering the battlefield, the pressure on the front line became much lighter. Compared to Jinmu, who focused on strengthening his combat strength, Shunyu was more of a support type. His ascension was due to his experience of sudden cerebral infarction during the high-intensity, long-term overtime work that could be said to be torture in the financial industry. When he awakened, his greatest wish was to quickly finish this pile of troublesome and heavy work and then go to sleep. Therefore, the name of his soul was rather funny. It was called Efficient Work Method Without Overtime. In short, it was a set of buffs that could clear one's mind, increase in speed, prevent injuries, and so on. He could provide the greatest amount of protection for ordinary people, preventing them from being corroded by the abyss. Although they would still be somewhat affected, it was much better than dying on the spot. As for the third stage, the ether-level stigmata, Shang Yang from Dongsha's lineage provided his soul ability with a greater range of expansion. After all, he was an exotic beast that once had the name of Lord Rain. His greatest effect was to sprinkle sweet rain all over the land. With the protection provided by the two of them, the Sublimator's suppression team's attack speed greatly increased, and they instantly gained the upper hand. However, AI Ching and Division Chief Fu in the command center did not feel as relaxed as most people. Division Chief Fu was very experienced and knew that this was only the beginning. On the other hand, AI Ching did not pay attention to the situation outside. Instead, she looked at the notebook in her hand and pondered. She frowned. A ritual, 10 times of gluttony, the bones of 100 people, the eyes of 1,000 birds, and 10,000 venomous snakes. Died in a spiritual coffin, so they cried. Transformed from hell, so they perished. The shadow of rebirth attaches itself to the wings, and the dormant birds fly to the sky. She read this prophecy poem in a complicated manner, trying to figure out the actual events that were hinted at. A ceremony could clearly point to the purified people. After all, this group of people who pretended to be mysterious would often hold ceremonies. There was a ceremony for sacrifices, a ceremony for praises, and even a ceremony for eating. So, what kind of ceremony were they planning to hold? The meaning of 10 times of gluttony was obvious. It was referring to the purified people's great hunting and sacrifice. The rancher's favorite was this kind of battle royale, where the food would fight to the death in an enclosed environment. And the final survivor of this sacrifice would be given the title of hunter and the reward of the rancher, becoming the most competitive member of the purified people. The whole process could be understood as you treated the rancher to a good meal, and the rancher generously gave you something good. And the bones of 100 people. She had figured it out over the past few days. It was probably referring to the frequent grave robberies in Xian High. In other words, they had collected the bones of 100 people. What was their goal? What was the point? The birds and venomous snakes were unclear. The meaning of the spiritual coffin was simple and straightforward. Any sublimator would understand it. It was a precious item that could provide a sublimator with a resurrection. After all, a sublimator's consciousness was placed in their soul and not their physical body. A normal person might die after their physical body was destroyed, but unless a sublimator's soul was exhausted, they could use something to repair their physical body or simply change to another body to achieve the effect of resurrection. However, this kind of item was rare in the world today. It was so expensive that it was priceless. After all, no one would sell their other life. Dying in the spiritual coffin and resurrecting in hell. That was to say, someone would carry out a resurrection ceremony? Then who was it? Although there was a high probability that it was a purified people, it could not be ruled out that it was someone else. As for the resurrection shadow and the dormant birds behind it, was there a bird-shaped high-grade stigmata among the enemies? There was a high possibility of this, and it could not be ignored so easily. Now it seemed that the purified people intended to gather power through sacrifices and rituals to carry out a resurrection to achieve a certain goal. Then, would this bring any changes to MOD? Even if the speculation was gradually getting closer to reality, it could only be slightly guarded against because there were no details or weaknesses that could be exploited. The so-called prophetic poems were such annoying things. Regardless of whether the author knew what would happen in the future or not, the things they wrote only had one purpose, and that was to never let the readers in the future guess, and also to show off their intelligence and wisdom. AI Ching cursed. At the scene, there was a new change in the situation. Across the entire Xian High City, the Stone Marrow restaurant in the suburbs now welcomed a somewhat reluctant customer. "Hello, your takeout." Outside the iron gate, the delivery man knocked hard on the fence in front of him. He looked worriedly at the gloomy and dilapidated house behind the iron gate, and the house that was full of the atmosphere of a horror movie. He repeatedly shouted several times, but no one responded. Just as he was about to go home, he suddenly heard a hoarse and sharp voice coming from the courtyard. "Put at the door." His hand trembled, and he almost dropped the pizza box on the ground. Immediately, as if he had just woken up from a dream, he put down the things in his hand, got on his small motorcycle, and ran away. After he disappeared, the crow on the tree slowly flew down. He used an invisible force to pick up the box, turned around, and flew into the house. "Sigh, this small body is really inconvenient. I can't even get takeout." As he sighed, the door of the house opened automatically, revealing the living room inside. In the center of the living room that was cleaned by Huai Shi, there was a table filled with all kinds of food, including 3 large bottles of Coca-Cola with the largest capacity, 2 buckets of Colonel's family buckets for boxes of chicken nuggets, and 2 boxes of pizza that just arrived. After putting down the pizza, Crow whistled as she sat on the mini sofa that was tailor-made for her. She enjoyed the sumptuous meal of the weekend and enjoyed the live broadcast of the war through the gigantic water mirror. "Fight, fight!" The crow, who enjoyed watching the drama, cheered for both sides. However, what was shown in the water mirror was not the battle in the Longma building, but the scene thousands of miles away. Like a heavenly eye, it broke through the shackles of the present world and looked down at the many borders that surrounded the present world like complicated bubbles, as well as the almost endless abyss of hell below the borders. The camera swept across the blazing flames of war in dozens of borders and finally fixed on the narrow area between the present world and the border, and the location was the coastal area of Dongsha, the sea that was now boiling. Compared to the small Xian High City, this was the main war zone between the pure people and the Social Security Bureau. Under layers of mournful white fog, the entire EC had almost turned into a cruel hunting ground, where countless huge sea monsters were constantly killing each other. Shrimps ate seaweed, small fish ate shrimps, big fish ate small fish, and monsters swallowed big fish and then swallowed each other. With the sound of a cold flute, the cruelty of the food chain had descended here. Chapter 79. Under the shroud of the fog. In just a few short hours, countless giant fish in the sea had been nurtured into all kinds of monsters. Although in everyone's impression, the rancher was a tyrannical god who treated all things as food, it was undeniable that the rancher's name also represented that he was in charge of a large amount of power related to life. After all, only when one's appetite was fat could one eat without worry. Even if it was just a little bit of rain sprinkled from the blessed land in the distant hell, it had already turned into a terrifying thick fog that shrouded the entire sea. In the thick fog, countless behemoths that were comparable to Godzilla were constantly killing each other, competing to be the winner of this huge predation. Hunting was happening in every corner. In the end, Thousands of monsters that were as large as battleships were born from the tens of thousands of hunting grounds. They gathered in one place, and their eyes were filled with the most primitive bestiality and hunger. They kept devouring all the food along the way, following the sound of the shepherd's flute as they moved toward the eastern summer. And just at the border of a sea, a whole row of steel warships had been slowly lined up. Countless soldiers were rushing to work overtime, preparing for an emergency battle. All kinds of fighter jets began to prepare, warm up, and take off in an orderly manner. And just at the rear, in the various desolate areas of the coastal area, ear-piercing sounds rang out in the military bases. Then, deep missile launchers slowly turned on one after another. Countless monsters that represented the predators whistled along the ocean currents in an instant. The first thing that rang out was a thunderclap. Above the clear sky, a thunderbolt suddenly fell from the sky. No one dared to stare at the appearance of this thunderbolt, because those who dared to look directly at it would forever lose their light in the tyrannical and solemn thunderbolt. In an instant, the thunderbolt rose out of thin air like a dragon moving in the sky. It stretched for thousands of miles, constantly sprinkling destructive branches on the mortal world. Wherever it passed, the thick fog that came from the purified people was destroyed. Those huge and tyrannical sea beasts were like thin paper in front of the thunderbolt, instantly torn into pieces and then burned into charred paste in high temperature. In the end, they really melted into the sea like pieces of paper, turning into a puddle of smelly burnt mud. Like an iron plow turning the earth, the thunderbolt was solid, stretching from north to west for thousands of miles, leaving a scar that was dozens of meters deep on the sea surface. And the thunderbolt that spread from both sides of the crack was dozens of miles away in an instant. Here, the boundary was drawn. With one strike, the casualties were heavy. And the Ascended who released the thunderbolt did not even show his face. But with the death of one sea beast, 10 more sea beasts expanded and grew again under the growth of the fog. Under the whip of the thunderbolt, the monsters only paused for a moment, then regrouped in the sound of the flute and charged toward the country's border. The thunderbolt was like a bugle call for war. At that moment, whether it was the main cannon or the secondary cannon, not to mention the machine guns, torpedoes, and deep-sea bombs, all the warships opened fire. On the aircraft carriers over time, the fighter jets soared into the sky like birds, roaring as they pounced toward the fog. In midair, the missile flew out with a blazing tail flame. Not only here, but at this moment, in all the launch bases along the coast, as if they were welcoming the spring festival, fireworks of war rose into the sky and pounced on the battlefield. This was a war in every sense of the word. A war between the East Xia Social Security Bureau and the people of the purified people under the attention of the whole world. No one doubted the outcome of this war. As a behemoth that controlled 1/10 of the Astronomical Association's power, Xia, one of the P5, had many years of war reserves and many ascended people. Would they not be able to defeat this group of lunatics like the purified people? There was no need for those private giants. No need for Taiching heavy industries, no need for the giant goose group, and no need for all kinds of border hunters. Just relying on the Social Security Bureau was enough to completely assess this disaster. The only uncertain thing was, how long could the purified people last under such terrifying firepower? Would it be enough to achieve their goal? Rome, Egypt, the American Freedom Alliance, the Russian Federation, and even Yingzhou, which was closest to the battlefield. At this moment, countless eyes were fixed on the battlefield, speculating about the next changes in this battle. Of course, there was also a crow who was gloating and watching the show. Amazing awesome. The crow sucked in big mouthfuls of Coca-Cola next to it and burped heartily. It threw the chicken pieces dipped in sauce into its mouth. It was impossible to see how the bird's beak ate such a large piece of chicken without even chewing. It kept cheering, hit him, burn his whole family, hit his mother. They had no idea which side this guy was on. However, the war still started abruptly and logically. When looking down from a huge perspective, everything seemed to have become distant. They could not see the casualties and tragic scenes. It was as if the light of steel and the color of sea monsters collided, strangling each other. Little bits of light kept falling from the sky, igniting a grand bonfire on the sea. The steel birds flying back and forth fought with the mutated birds in the sky, and then they kept falling into the sea where the killing and fighting were the most intense. The huge warships kept bursting out roars, shaking the sea and creating layers of huge waves. Then, the giant sea monsters in the sea jumped up, opened their bloody mouths, and bit the entire warship in half. At first glance, it seemed that the purified people had the upper hand. The fog seemed to cover the sea area endlessly, constantly giving birth to new sea monsters. But until now, except for the beginning, there were no traces of the purified people in Doomsday. They only relied on the rules of the present realm and the huge steel torrent to forcibly stop this group of monsters from the border outside the country's borders. Even so, it was so tragic. However, not a single sea beast managed to cross that sacred boundary. Any sea monster that tried to go around the front of the battlefield to steal the chicken was chased by the crazy warships. The crazy cannons were fired until this group of beasts was completely turned into a pile of debris. And under the constant fire, the fog finally could not continue, revealing the shadow hidden behind the countless sea monsters. That's right, it was a shadow floating on the sea. No matter how they observed, they could not find any corresponding objects above and below the shadow. It was as if it had appeared out of thin air. It existed on the surface of the sea, revealing its outline with the undulation of the waves. It was like a huge fish that was as big as an island. In the middle of the shadow, like a whale, there was a huge hole constantly spitting out rain from the paradise. And on the head of the giant fish shadow, countless dense tentacles stretched out. Those dim tentacles were constantly dancing, as if they were lashing the boundary of the present realm from a distance, making a sharp flute sound. It was hard to tell what it was. There had never been such a strange substance in the present realm. In fact, it was not a substance, but a border that was moving close to the present realm. That independent border was like a bubble, sticking to the surface of the present realm. Countless tentacles pulled countless sea monsters, ordering them to move forward. With the endless number of sea monsters pulling the carriage for itself, it slowly moved closer to the eastern summer border. But at the same time, it seemed to be alive. Majestic and gloomy waves of origin substance spread out from the shadow. After losing the cover of the fog, it was as clear as the existence of the scorching sun. A living border. No, it should be a monster that was between a border and ascendant. This was one of the gifts that the ranch master had scattered to the human world from the paradise. Level 5 stigmata from the main lineage of the Abyss Ranch. Enough to be called the incarnation of miracles, the philosopher's stone, Dagon. The moment the fog dissipated, the shadow quickly twisted and became thin in an instant, as if it was struggling to escape from the edge of the present realm, trying to avoid everyone's observation. But at the same time, a cold laugh sounded from thousands of miles away in the sky. Why bother? That low voice said, "You're already here." Thousands of miles away, the sky suddenly shook like a drum. As if the iron curtain was broken, countless cracks appeared in the clear sky. That was the proof that the fragile atmosphere was on the verge of collapse, unable to bear the excessive power. The roar of the sky drum reverberated between the mortal world and smashed into the sea like an iron hammer. It was just the sound. Countless sea monsters were crushed in response. Wherever the sound wave passed, it was like the tide had crushed a sandcastle piled up by sand. The blood of the sea monsters splattered everywhere, dyeing the blue sea water into various disgusting colors. Then, a thunderbolt appeared out of thin air, like the legendary Jinmu, falling from the sky, sprinkling electric light that covered the sky and the sun. Everything was shrouded in that electric light. It pierced through the sea and the sky, turning into a hook shape, and was thrown toward Dagon, who had escaped from the present realm. The thunderbolt sank into the sea, as if it had entered another world, without the slightest electric light leaking out. Then, the thunderbolt shook violently, and the shadow in the sea gradually became thin. The thunderbolt was like a hook, and the huge fish had become its prey. As the thunderbolt rose bit by bit, countless electric currents split from the top, violently spread in all directions, smashing all the sea monsters that tried to get close to it into pieces. For a time, countless amounts of blood burst out of the sea, and in the sea, the shadow of the huge fish that was originally thin became clear again, even if its struggling posture was unwilling and furious. "Give me up!" A hoarse roar like thunder exploded in the sky. At that moment, the sea surface shattered, and a mountain-like silhouette was pulled by the thunderbolt, splitting the waves from the sea and completely falling into the present realm. The waves were monstrous. The moment the sublimator who had turned into Dagon appeared, he tried to open up his divine mark and mutate the entire sea. But then, a series of thunderbolts fell from the sky like railings, piercing deep into the depths of the sea. From the surface of the huge sea, the thunderbolts connected with each other, forming a cage that was enough to seal the mountain-like giant fish. Above Dagon's back, a slender and thin figure slowly emerged, raising her beautiful face to the sky. The originally charming and compassionate maternal face was now full of chilling ferocity and viciousness. A furious roar. Then, the seven seas trembled. At that moment, between the countless thunderbolts, a solemn figure slowly emerged in the void, waving the long whip condensed by the thunderbolts in his hand. As if sitting on the throne in the center of the world, the slightly old middle-aged man looked down, his eyes bursting with a blazing divine light. The crowned one with the fifth-order stigmata Kirin, and now the strongest existence among the guardians of the present realm in Dongsha, finally showed himself on the battlefield. Omnidirectional mountains and rivers, full of light. Fu Sangwang. Chapter 80. Heaven and Earth Stagnated. The moment Fu Sangwang appeared in the sky, all the sea beasts convulsed violently, trembling under the illumination of the lightning. Their previous ferocious aura could no longer be seen. Even Dagon, who was also at the 5th level, stiffened for a moment under the suppression of that invisible aura. This was the suppression of the heavens. In front of the Chilan stigmata, there was no room for the beasts to act like demons. In the classification of alchemists, a stigmata that had reached the 5th level was known as the legendary Philosopher's Stone that contained all the mysteries. The reason was that reaching such a level of power was already the incarnation of miracles, the reflection of the gods on the ground. And since ancient times, in the legends of Dongsha, the Chilan was far closer to the position of the gods than anything else. Otherwise, it would not be known as the messenger of the heavens. Even though they were all stigmata, there were still differences between them. And in the 5th level, the Chilan's ranking was fixed in the front row, even in the whole world. Even if Dagon had fused with the ancient Semitic mythological source book and gained divinity, how could it compete with the thousands of years of accumulation of the Dongsha dynasty? Not to mention, they had encountered a freak like Fu Sangwang. Originally, the Saint Chilan was a benevolent commander of all the beasts, conveying the auspicious sign of the heavens and wisdom to the common people. Judging from the legends, it should be more inclined towards the command and support type. In the end, no one would have thought that Fu Sangwang was so stubborn. After decades of tempering in hell, he forcibly extended the power of punishment on behalf of the heavens from his talent of conveying the heavens. He forcibly turned auspicious into ominous, and after extracting the power of yin and yang, he became the one to be crowned, a genuine king. Since then, the lightning was invincible, and there was nothing it could not reach within 10,000 miles. Not only was its lethality amazing, but it also had an innate restraint on all the stigmata with beast attributes. As long as the sublimata with beast attributes encountered him, they could only be beaten up like a son. It was easy to deal with Dagon, who could only be used as a carrier in the 5th level of the stigmata. But this did not mean that this power was easy to obtain. Even the crow, after seeing such a scene, could only swallow the Coca-Cola that was rolled up on its wings. It cupped its hands and sighed in admiration. You know how to play. You know how to play. It was precisely because she was well aware of how difficult it was that she was able to understand how much blood he had paid for this astonishing talent and perseverance. The so-called stigmata was the result of analyzing the relics of the gods. It was a tool to maintain the existence of the present realm and explore the depths of hell. His goal from the very beginning was to transform himself from an ordinary being step by step until he approached the level of God. However, this process wasn't gentle, nor was it comfortable. Instead, it required one to face a violent transformation and a terrible price. So long as one took a wrong step, there would be the danger of falling into the abyss. After all, from a moment they became transcendents, the ascendants had become existences that replaced the gods. They were an indispensable link in this world, and it would not be an exaggeration to call them the chosen. To this day, the Astronomy Society was still analyzing the heritage of the gods, expanding the depths of hell, and improving the system by relying on the 16 pillars that supported the present realm. Aside from the various nicknames, the Astronomy Society would simply and crudely use the ranks in alchemy to name the stages of the stigmata. The first stage was Mercury, the second stage was gold, the third stage was ether, the fourth stage was star's nest, the fifth stage was philosopher's stone, and even the crown at the top and a natural enemy who broke through this limit and became the incarnation of the gods. It seemed simple, but in fact, it was like groping forward in the dark. Through the most basic stigmata, the ascendants followed the complicated and hidden roadmap as if they were climbing up, constantly retrieving and searching for miracles and all kinds of strange things in the abyss. They used it to accumulate and transform, hoping to finally advance to the end of the road, the peak of all things, the place where the gods were. There were too many unknowns and dangers. Even the slightest change would lead to unpredictable results. Not being able to advance was only the lightest punishment. Falling directly into hell and being contaminated as a corrosive and solidified was the most common outcome. Didn't the leading organization of the Astronomy Society in the past, Utopia, not lead to the later division and degeneration because of the careless exploration of this power? Although it was unknown what kind of price was paid for such a crude change, to be able to succeed, it must have been an unimaginable hardship and luck that could not be replicated. Now, with a single blow, Fu Cangguang forcefully pulled Dagon to the border. Then, he drew a circle on the ground and forcibly imprisoned it. Then, the moment Dagon was exposed, the surrounding thick fog suddenly distorted and tore apart. Countless faint figures appeared on the sea and ran toward it. It was almost possible to distinguish all the common and uncommon weapons, cold weapons, hot weapons, and even all kinds of relics of the border. 100,000 people stepped on the solidified waves and rushed toward Dagon. The number of people was not an exaggeration in the ordinary sense. It was 100,000 people, 100,000 ascendants with the same face. Attack, defense, shackle, attack, excavation. In an instant, a dazzling work appeared from the 100,000 people who cooperated with each other as if they were one person. Even though there were countless casualties under Dagon's fierce struggle, more figures immediately split and joined the heated battle and work. Quantity, pure quantity. Even the endless sea beasts could not resist 100,000 times the efficiency and 100,000 times the output. Stay strong. The Clouds Army. It was another stage 5 ascendant from Dongxia, Yin Xinga. If it was only one person, there was nothing to be afraid of. If there were only 100,000 people, there was nothing to be worried about. However, if these 100,000 people were all armed to the teeth with relics of the border and mass-produced weapons, and they cooperated with each other like one person, then there would be terrible consequences. They were not afraid of sacrifice. They were not afraid of death. Even if more than half of them were wiped out in an instant, there would be new figures who would pick up the equipment of the dead and arm themselves, and then rush to the front line again without fear of death. They know he was not fighting. The fighting was naturally handled by Fu Sangwang. What he was doing was building. No, it should be said that he was building for destruction. It was like assembling a siege vehicle in front of the enemy. 100,000 peasants began to build arrow towers against the wall of the purified people. With this terrifying manpower and speed, countless huge instruments were carried on Dagon's body and were quickly riveted and welded. Then, with the endless flow of electricity, a strange light glowed. Although it was impossible to tell what it was definitely not a Wi-Fi signal. The purified people hiding in the border finally could not wait for the situation to worsen. White figures flew out of Dagon's whale-like blowhole, spread their wings, and the halo above their heads rose. There was no doubt that they were the solidified people hiding in the blessed land, known as the hunting angels who were known as the rancher's knife and fork. There was no doubt that divine power was operating on their spread wings at this moment. The fanatical hunting angels chanted hymns, gathered into an army, and raised their weapons towards the Qilin in the sky. A four-edged flame sword extended from the void, still spinning on its own, stirring up the wind and clouds, and colliding with the lightning. It was so huge that it could hold up the gap between the sky and the earth. The flame soared and the lightning shook the sky endlessly, and under the counterattack of countless sea beasts and the purified people, Yanshinga finally completed his work. I'm done. Hundreds of figures worked together and connected the last cable. They turned around and roared. At that moment, the power from the void flowed from the machine, and the power of the great mystic Zarathustra was exerted on Dagon, completely fixing it in place. No, it was frozen in the sea. The mission was completed. Yanshinga heaved a sigh of relief, and then heard a hoarse roar behind him. The purified people's counterattack had begun. Old Fu! Old Fu! Yanshinga subconsciously called for help, and then found in despair that Fu Sangwang was resisting the rancher's god's sword of retribution and had no time to care about anything else. He had to do it himself. The 100,000 figures were awkwardly suppressing the purified people who were rushing forward. When the other side began to fight with all their might, Yanshinga was in an extremely difficult situation and could only rely on the advantage of numbers to tangle with the other side, pulling hair, stepping on toes, raising weapons, stabbing eyes. 100,000 bruised and swollen faces looked up at the sky and shouted, "Little White, if you don't come, I'll die. I'm coming, I'm coming." As the white pigeons circled, no figures appeared. F***CK, I'm really going to die. Ah, my eyes, F***CK, you bastard, where are you kicking? Behind him, it had already become a fight with the purified people. I'm really going to die. How much longer do you need? Soon, soon. White Emperor's son's hurried voice sounded from the void. Just a moment. Just a moment. Yanshinga could only vomit blood in grief and anger. 100,000 of himself meant 100,000 ways to die, and the ability to infinitely split also infinitely weakened his fighting power. But in order to maintain the integrity of the machine behind him, he could not slack off, and had to build this dam with himself. Just as he was about to break down, a short and slender figure finally fell from the sky and fell into the sea in a sorry state. Her wet cheeks surfaced. "I'm lost again," the young girl shouted and complained. "How many times have I told you that border transit is not accurate at all? You just don't want to change. Take the car. Can't you just take the car?" Yanshinga was about to explode with anger. "Hurry up and help. I can't hold on much longer." Thus, White Emperor's son stretched out his hand and drew a line in the void. The group of purified people who were playing with each other among the 100,000 doppelgangers instantly split into pieces, and blood did not even have time to gush out before they were cut into pieces and turned into dust. Yanshinga was dumbfounded. "Just you? I don't know." The young girl climbed out of the sea in a sorry state and hurriedly wiped the water from her hair, her face blank. "I was afraid of getting lost, so I left at 3:30 and ran for a few hours. Could it be that I've left them behind? Where did you go?" Yanshinga raised his wrist in despair and showed her his watch. "It's only 3:29. Before he finished speaking, a long white rainbow fell from the sky and poured into Dagon's blowhole like the Milky Way. Surging waves of air swept in all directions. At that moment, whether it was through water mirrors, satellites, or all kinds of illusions, everyone who stared at this battlefield was dumbfounded. Wait, what are you doing? Chapter 81. Just as everyone stared blankly, the mighty rainbow formed by the torrent of source form completely pierced through Dagon's body and then broke into the border. Then, using this as a springboard, it pointed to the blessed paradise. In an instant, the rainbow turned into a bridge. Using the connection between Dagon and the rancher, it forcibly opened up the coordinates of the blessed paradise and then built a road. Since the start of the war, the ascendants who had been waiting until now appeared on the bridge. Countless figures flew across the rainbow bridge and rushed straight to the blessed paradise at the end of the rainbow. The surprise attack had begun. At this moment, not only on this sea, but also on various coastal cities, large and small battles between the purified people and the Social Security Bureau were unfolding. But even if they had the upper hand, it still could not solve any problems. Passively defending could only passively wait for the enemy to make a move. Rather than that, it was better to attack the enemy directly, break into the blessed paradise. Okay, I should go too. The little girl called the White Emperor's child shook off the water on her body and raised her arm to catch the pigeons falling from the sky. She waved at Yenqinga handsomely. I'll be back soon. After that, she turned back and jumped into the rainbow behind her, disappearing among the many figures. Don't get lost. Yenqinga poked his head out and shouted worriedly, not knowing if she heard him. Even when she was in the present realm, she was still able to jump around for several hours in an unknown place where time and space were distorted. To be lost to such an extent was already shocking enough to make ghosts and gods weep. But it was better if she got lost before. At most, she would only mumble a few times, and it would not delay anything. If she got lost in the blessed paradise, then it would really be over. But she would not go that far, right? In Exine High, the rumbling had come to an end. In the place where the Dragon Horse Plaza used to be, there was now only a ruin left. Among the broken walls, countless corpses of border mutants were scattered in the dust and mud. Fresh blood of various colors mixed together, emitting a foul smell. The last remaining fanatics seemed to have given up hope of breaking out. Under the guidance of the old priest, they surrounded the huge broken bronze mirror and prayed fervently. They did not care about the suppression force behind them. The sound of praying became louder and louder, until gunshots rang out. The priest, who had been standing in front of the bronze mirror for a long time, fell on his back. There was a bloody wound in his chest, and blood was gushing out of his mouth. Director Fu changed the magazine expressionlessly and kicked away the screaming fanatic in front of him. He lowered his head and looked at the twisted face. Even though the fanatic was dying, his lips were still open as he prayed with difficulty. Director Fu sneered. Now that things have come to this, are you still hoping for a miracle from your Shang deity? Miracles are everywhere. What a coincidence. Director Fu said indifferently, I have a miracle for you too, and it's a 125mm caliber one. Behind him, the sound of steel rolling over cement rang out. Amidst the loud rumbling, the huge tank drove into the ruins. The black muzzle slowly turned around and aimed at the remaining group of lunatics. Director Fu turned around indifferently and waved his hand. Send these bastards to heaven. You will regret for what you have done. In the pool of blood, the priest's face became twisted and venomous. Soon, you will see the arrival of the almighty Holy Spirit with your own eyes. Boom! After the sound of the cannon, there was nothing left. It's finally over. Director Fu touched his pocket and took out his cigarette box and a nicotine patch. After thinking for a while, he threw the nicotine patch aside and reached for the cigarette box. Forget it. Let's celebrate. Just one. Just one. Just as he lit the cigarette and blew out a puff of smoke, he saw a black fog gradually rising in the distant sky. In the northeast, he was stunned for a moment and subconsciously calculated the distance. It seems about the same as the position of the Special Affairs Department. Amidst his astonishment, streams of smoke rose up from the ground one after another. They were like pitch-black pillars, and even the strong winds were unable to blow them away. They propped up the space between the sky and the earth, drawing the entire city in step by step. AI Ching, who was beside him, looked up at the sky. So, this is the meaning of a ritual? They heard screams coming from behind them. A large amount of thick smoke spewed out of the broken bronze mirror. The terrifying concentration of the abyss precipitated in an instant, corroding the surrounding people into strange shapes. Before the smoke had time to spread, a gunshot rang out from AI Ching, shattering the bronze mirror into pieces. But soon, countless scattered pieces of copper gathered out of thin air, and thick smoke rose again. The mutated people seemed to be pulled by the smoke, screaming as they were swallowed into the bronze mirror. At that moment, a dagger flew out from AI Ching's hand, emitting a golden light in mid-air, leaving a straight trace. The dagger was nailed into the bronze mirror, pouring the endless light contained in the dagger into it, illuminating the fragmented world and the bloody scene that looked like hell. It was as if the sun had appeared out of thin air. The border relic that once severely injured Faust suddenly shattered at this moment. Then, the condensed light recklessly refracted and collided with the fragments of the mirror. Finally, it gathered in one place and exploded. The bronze mirror suspended in mid-air shook violently, turned red, and quickly melted. Copper liquid fell like raindrops, and then it fell apart. At the last moment, an inhuman roar of anger rang out, as if a feast had been interrupted. A huge, strange palm forcibly stretched out from it, causing the surrounding scene to crack like a broken mirror. In the blink of an eye, the world spun and everything disappeared as if it was an illusion. When Director Fu came to his senses, he subconsciously looked to the side, but there was no one in the wheelchair beside him. AI Ching had disappeared without a trace, along with the other two ascendants. Half an hour ago, in the prison on the second basement of the Special Affairs Division. As the light of a summoning animation lit up on the phone screen, impassioned music began to play. SSR, SSR, SSR. Huaisher stared at the screen with wide eyes and shouted with anticipation. That's right, Huaisher also got his phone. Not only was he connected to the Wi-Fi here, but he was also lying in bed playing mobile games all day long, as if it was his own home. Moreover, after he had money, he became bolder. After thinking for a night, he gritted his teeth and charged 30 yuan into the game. For the first time in his life, he became a monthly card user. Not to mention anything else, he instantly felt like he was noble. It was different from before. Now, he looked at free players as if they were little eunuchs who were studying with him. After floating for a long time and finally calming down, it was time for the exciting card draw. The stock that he had accumulated during this period of time, and the 20 stones that the monthly card gave him every day, added together, he could draw 10 consecutive draws. In the last few minutes before the end of the White Emperor's card pool, Huaisher resolutely pressed the button for the 10th draw. Then, in the constantly flickering light, his smile gradually disappeared. As he drew again and again, his last hope disappeared in the blue sky of Africa. Why is this happening? He collapsed on the bed powerlessly. As the countdown ended, he said goodbye to the White Emperor card in the pool forever. He was speechless. You're the only card I want. JP while the fat otaku was crying, he suddenly heard footsteps from the stairs. A serious-looking prison guard walked downstairs with 2 armed guards. They went straight to Huaisher's cell next door. Chi Yuan, let's go. The unfamiliar prison guard knocked on the bars of the cell with a baton and urged loudly. Huaisher, who was lying on the bed, raised his head in shock and looked at them. He frowned. He smelled a familiar scent from the 2 guards and the prison guard. The smell of blood. Isn't old Lee on duty today? He asked casually, but he didn't get an answer. Instead, he felt a cold, murderous intent coming from the 2 armed guards. He paused for a second, sighed, and threw his phone away. I originally wanted to sit in prison peacefully. When the phone spun in the air, The boy who was paralyzed on the bed had already bounced up from the broken bedboard, dodging the blazing bullets that followed closely behind. Then, the burning palm spun in the air and threw an invisible axe at the guard. The axe blade whistled through the air and directly chopped the palm that pulled the trigger. Then, the gray rope extended, wrapped around the barrel, and suddenly pulled back. Huaisher landed on the ground, caught the submachine gun in his hand, and pulled the trigger at the guard who was empty-handed. The head exploded. Then, he clenched his fist and turned it into ashes, but no thick smoke appeared. He awkwardly found that his recent days were peaceful and comfortable. He slept and ate. He could also play mobile games every day in prison. It was difficult to accumulate any negative energy. Unknowingly, his negative energy machine had been worn away by the comfortable prison life. The life of a fat otaku was terrifying. He could only awkwardly dodge the other guards aiming and shooting. He hurriedly threw the rope. The rope flew out like a snake and wrapped around the guard's body. In an instant, he was tied up like a dumpling. Huaisher took out the axe and slashed at the railing. In the roar of the metal collision, he kicked off a section of the railing and squeezed out of the cage. He looked at the cell next to him. He was afraid that Qi Yuan would be silenced in just a few seconds. But the expected bloody scene did not happen. Behind the open cell door, the originally majestic prison guard was now devoutly prostrating at Qi Yuan's feet. He raised his hands high and offered a dark wine. "You're here." Qi Yuan looked up at him, but his face was completely different from what Huaisher imagined. He was scarily thin. Only his eyes were bloodshot, as if he had struggled in a nightmare for a long time. "Well, you can send me off." He held the small wine jug in his hand and grinned at Huaisher. He raised his head and drank it in one gulp. Huaisher couldn't stop him. He subconsciously reached out to pull the rope to pull the wine jug back, but he felt a terrifying wave of air sweep over. It was as if a bomb had exploded from Qi Yuan's body. Chapter 82. The terrifying power destroyed the entire cage in an instant. Amidst the roar, countless steel pipes were twisted and fell apart along with the cement. They rolled in all directions, almost burying Huaisher in the ruins. At the center of the explosion, Qi Yuan seemed to have lost gravity. He floated in mid-air, spasming violently, allowing the darkness that had entered his body to pass through his body. In the end, the darkness in his eyes spread, and there was no longer any trace of white. He slowly landed on the ground, stepping on the mangled corpses under his feet, and let out a sigh of relief. "What the F***CK is this?" Huaisher groaned under the cover of the rubble. "Didn't I tell you long ago, Huaisher?" Qi Yuan looked back at him with a mocking smile. "I've tried all the methods I can imagine, all of them. However, I forgot to tell you the last part," he said. "Then I received power from the paradise of the abyss, from the hands of the Savior Society." Qi Yuan probably never dreamed that his son, who he had raised as a good-for-nothing, had already converted to the Savior Society. His position was even higher than Wang Hai's, and he had already been baptized by the Lord. Now, he had drunk the blood that represented power, received the protection and blessing from the paradise, and was assimilated by the power of hell. Or to put it more accurately, if a sublimator's will was detached from matter, then at this moment, Qi Yuan had taken the initiative to embrace the erosion of hell, a solidifier who had merged himself with the eternal abyss. The current Qi Yuan was a monster that had been transformed by the abyss. "Now I have power." Qi Yuan laughed, cheered, and opened his arms. Then, countless blood rushed from the corpses on the ground and from above the stairs, gathered on his body, and turned into a blood-red robe. Huaisher quietly raised the muzzle, wanting to pull the trigger. But at that moment, the gun in his hand disappeared, and it was twisted into a ball in Qi Yuan's hand. Then, Qi Yuan slowly pulled him up by the collar. "You have to understand." Qi Yuan grinned, and his smile was ferocious. "This is not a personal grudge." Bang! He was thrown to the ground by Qi Yuan, and he felt like he was going to shatter. A twisted steel bar from the broken wall protruded from his chest, pushing against half of his shattered lung. Then, Qi Yuan's hand pierced through his bones and into his chest. Then he crushed the thing that was beating inside. His heart ruptured. Huaisha twitched for a moment before she stopped moving. Qi Yuan slowly withdrew his hand and threw the shard to the side. He retracted his gaze and turned to leave, walking up the stairs step by step. Not long after, chaotic gunshots could be heard from above. Soon, all the sounds disappeared. In the silence, Huaisha's stiff body twitched slightly. His eyes, which had rolled back, quietly rolled back. He listened attentively, but did not hear any sound. The guy seemed to have left. He really left. When he came to this conclusion, his face began to twitch in pain. Is anyone there? He struggled to speak. Help! Help! Most people who had reached this level should have died. He also felt like he was going to die. But why did it seem like he was not dead yet? He could only struggle to see if he could still be saved. He no longer hoped that there was anyone alive in the Special Affairs Division who could save him. He only hoped that the lazy crow would not be too late. Oh, why are you in such a miserable state after not seeing you for a while? The crow's voice sounded in his ears. Then he saw a familiar face. She was no longer in the form of a bird. She had once again transformed into a human. She was standing in front of Huaisha, her gorgeous dress almost extended to his side. She lowered her head and looked at him with her delicate cheeks. She was also holding a cup of Coca-Cola in her hand, which she took a few sips from time to time. She was so relaxed and happy. How nice, how nice. If Huaisha wasn't about to die, she might have even asked for a cup to drink. Huaisha opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood at her, meaning to stop watching and save him. I understand. She lifted her dress slightly with one hand and squatted down, revealing a slender and straight white calf in front of Huaisha, as if to entice him to look up and continue to explore. But the hand that had let go of her skirt reached under her collar and pulled out a strange key. She waved it at him and smiled happily. So, the key, do you deserve it? Huaisha nodded in panic. I deserve it. You deserve it? The crow raised her eyebrows. How many do you deserve? I'll get as many as I can. Huaisha was going crazy. Can you hurry up? I'm really going to die. Don't worry. I'm waiting for you to die, right? So you won't have to suffer so much. She calmly said something extraordinary. But this might be a good opportunity. After all, in the plan, the transformation of the completion potion is only half completed. We can take the opportunity to complete the remaining half. But before that, she paused for a moment and smiled mysteriously. Then, she took out an old sheepskin scroll from her sleeve. When she unfolded it, it revealed strange and evil characters. They looked like seal scripts, but they also looked like a variant of some kind of alphabet. Her slender and delicate fingers unfolded the sheepskin roll in front of the teenager. Can you sign this? Anyway, you'll take advantage of the situation, right? You flatter me. Anyway, if I don't sign it, I'll die. You'll sign it, right? She smiled happily. Up to you. Huaisha sighed and found that his left hand had regained the sense of touch. He gritted his teeth, raised his finger, and used all his strength to write a dark name on the scroll. Huaisha. When he finished the last stroke, a dark flame ignited from the scroll and burned the whole scroll to ashes in an instant. The demon-like flame spread in an instant, climbing up his body through his fingers and into his lungs. It was as if it was attached to the skeleton, burning vigorously. Every thought was swallowed up by the flame. The indescribable pain engulfed him, making Huaisha let out a hoarse scream in the fire. He struggled wildly, almost breaking free from the steel bar in his chest, and got up from the ground. But then he saw the woman raise her leg, suddenly stepping on his body, and stepped on him back. Calm down. Don't look like you haven't seen the world. Crow forcibly held him down, then reached out and pulled out the twisted steel bar from Huaisha's chest. Together with the cement and blood at the end, she threw it aside. Didn't you just want to make a key? Here, take it. She wiped the non-existent sweat on her forehead, turned the gorgeous key in her hand slightly, aimed at Huaisha's open chest, and suddenly stabbed it in. Then, she twisted it with all her might. As if the door to hell had been opened in his body, Huaisha felt an endless torrent gushing out from the open crack, almost filling every inch of his body in an instant, inflating him like a balloon. But just when he thought he was about to explode, the flames covering his body burned vigorously, igniting all the things that poured into his body and evaporating them. Only the essence that was difficult to burn was left, slowly merging into his body under the high temperature. It was as if he had turned into a wick. He had to endure the suffocating torture of the kerosene under his feet and the flames above his head. Huaishir spat out a mouthful of blood, but the blood seemed to have deteriorated, turning into a dark color, falling into the air and making a sizzling sound. In the midst of the severe pain, he opened his eyes wide. What the hell is this? Your stigmata. Crow was still stepping on him, motioning him not to move. Then, she summoned the Book of Destiny in Huaishir's soul with one hand, opened it in her hand, and pressed Huaishir's head with the other hand. Huaishir, under the witness of the kingdom of heaven, I make a contract with you. At that moment, Huaishir felt as if his head had been hit by a hammer. His vision turned black, and his soul was shaken by her words. I promise in the name of... Huaishir seemed to hear her say a name, but he couldn't hear it clearly because the power of the name was shaking him, making it difficult for him to keep his will clear, almost collapsing under the pressure of the stormy waves. My royal power will be manifested here, and you will live with its glory forever. Boom! Huaishir felt as if he had become a bonfire. His consciousness was freed from the body that had turned into firewood, merged into the black flame, and rose up, expanding and contracting endlessly, dancing on the edge of destruction and renewal. Huaishir finally saw her, the woman who made a contract with him. It wasn't the illusion that was so exquisite that it was like a dream, but the stormy waves hidden behind the illusion. The endless flames and light turned into lightning, as if they wanted to fill the entire world. As the terrifying power surged, 10,000 streaks of light rose from her eyes like a tidal wave and fell into the seemingly endless sea of light. When she spread her wings, endless light illuminated the world. When she lowered her eyes, all things fell into the fire of karma. The world was collapsing, and the world was being reborn. The existence and destruction of all things seemed to be unified in her hands, and was given a beginning, an end, and the meaning of everything. Now, Wanxiang lowered her eyes in front of him, and announced to him with great majesty and coldness, I will bear witness to you. She whispered softly in Huaishir's ear, just as you will bear witness to me. In that instant, the endless illusions collapsed and disappeared without a trace. It was like a long and painful dream. Huaishir felt the door that stretched out of his body suddenly close, and then the flames rolled back. With the push of her palm, Huaishir's will return to his body again, just like a sword that was sealed in its scabbard after being forged by thunder and fire. Huaishir felt his heart beating. Blood flowed in his veins and spread to his limbs and bones. He felt his lungs breathing, and then he smelled the residual blood in the air and heard the roar from the distant street. He felt his hands, and then he felt his feet again. He felt that he had returned to the world again. He was still alive, and his body was intact. Huaishir suddenly opened his eyes and recalled the painful dream. He screamed and jumped up from the ground. As if afraid that the nightmarish memories would catch up with him, he ran wildly in the cage, from one end to the other, and then from the other end to the other. After a long time, he finally calmed down. He held the wall. He was sweating profusely and panting in fear. Finally, he lowered his head and looked blankly at the place where the strange feeling came from. What the hell is this? Chapter 83. What the F***CK is this? Huaishir was startled. He pulled open the broken collar and touched his chest in horror. In the middle of his chest, there was a round hole the size of a mug, but he couldn't see his lungs and internal organs through the hole. He could only see darkness. It was like a crack leading to the abyss. He summoned the courage to reach in and touch it. It was like touching his own body from the inside, but he couldn't feel the existence of his internal organs and bones. He seemed to have turned into a hollow person. That layer of darkness was as cold as liquid ammonia. It had a cold and heavy texture, and it filled every corner behind the crack. Come, drink a cup of water to calm down. The person next to her handed her a cup of Coke that was still emitting cold air. There was even a straw in the cup. "Oh, thank you." Huaishir subconsciously took 2 sips before he reacted. He glared at Crow, who had turned back into a bird. "It's you, didn't you agree?" Crow looked at him innocently. "I asked you if you deserve the key. You said I deserved it, so I gave it to you. Besides, you have to get used to your stigmata. Otherwise, how are you going to live?" "Stigmata?" Huaishir was stunned and pointed to the big hole in his chest. "This stupid thing is the stigmata you told me about?" "Yes." Crow spread her wings and proudly introduced. "The first stage of the Abyss pedigree. Stigmata of the Spirit's Gold Collection Enhanced Version V2. 0. What Abyss? What Spirit? What Gold Collection?" Huaishir was confused by her words. It took a long time for him to react. "Which country's pedigree is the Abyss pedigree? Spirit? Doesn't it mean ghost?" "Yes, so I have to wait for you to cool down before I can do anything. Otherwise, why would I feed you so many poisons?" Crow looked at him worriedly, as if he didn't even understand such a simple thing. How could she be at ease, letting him roam the pugilistic world in the future? Huaishir closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he grabbed her and summoned an axe to her neck. "I'll give you another chance to reorganize your vocabulary. What is this thing?" Crow's eyes rolled. "It's a long story." "Then make it short. To put it simply, it is a stigmata that is specially designed for border survival and abyssal exploration. It adopts the popular ghost legends and the most classic structure in every country. It is a stigmata that is custom-made for you. It is a perfect match for you." "Where?" Huaishir stared at her. "You see, weren't you a negative energy machine before?" The crow raised a wing and gestured a number in a very cartoonish manner. "Now it's 2. Huaishir was indignant. "Isn't this the same as before? But your efficiency is too high. The output is higher. Do you understand?" Crow retorted. "How can it be the same? You've directly gone from a black and white screen to a smartphone. What else do you want? Heaven." "I didn't sleep or rest for a long time for your stigmata. I finally made it and sent it to you. I also spent a lot of effort to save your dog life. In the end, you didn't even say a word of thanks after installing it. My conscience has been eaten by a dog." She glared at Huaishir. Huaishir suddenly lowered his head with a little guilty conscience. He immediately realized that she had shaken him again. When she spoke, her mouth still tasted like pizza. "Don't tell me I've become her test subject? Forget it. I forgive you. After all, it's not easy for everyone." While Huaishir was stunned, she jumped out of Huaishir's mouth and generously waved her wings. "Apologize, and this matter will be considered over." "Apologize my ass." Huaishir rolled his eyes and looked down at the big hole in his chest. He had a feeling that something terrible would come out of it. "Don't worry, nothing will happen." Crow tossed a thick booklet over. "Here, I prepared a manual for you, as well as a plan for the future. Although it's not currently in the public domain, but Spectre is my blood, sweat, and tears. Let's not talk about anything else, but I can guarantee its versatility. It's not like some unorthodox stigmata that only has one way of promotion and a superior stigmata. There's even only one way from the beginning, and the path may be broken in the middle. The better ones are 2 or 3 ways. At most, you can move around in the same spectrum. The corresponding field of Ghost is definitely the most extensive, even more extensive than Believer, which is of little value. Whether it's in the country or abroad, you can advance any negative attribute stigmata in any spectrum. It doesn't matter what direction you want to develop." Huaishir suddenly understood. "Isn't that a universal plug? Can I hear a good word from you?" Crow rolled her eyes at him. "At this time, you should thank me for my great kindness. It's better if you kneel down and kowtow a few times and then cry and shout that you want to be my dog for the rest of your life, right?" Huaishir ignored her. He probably understood what she meant. In terms of versatility, Ghost was to some extent a priceless treasure. After all, although they were all called stigmata, sometimes the difference between different stigmata lineages was like the difference between a zebra and a monkey. Unless you ruthlessly cut off the branch that had merged with your soul, you would also have to pay a huge price to succeed. Although they were both giants, the 100-eyed giants and the titans were not the same species. They were both Phoenix, and the Phoenix was completely different. Not to mention cross-spectrum advancement. The price of changing the path of advancement within the same spectrum was exaggerated and frightening. After all, the method of changing the path of advancement was only suitable for those who had nowhere to go. The real big spectrum never needed to consider these problems. If there was a road to heaven, who would be so free as to go to a dead end halfway? It was so refreshing to have a big family and a big business. For example, the Eastern Summer Spectrum, which was now recognized as one of the most abundant lineages, could even be subdivided into several branches. Now, there were more than 14 complete paths of advancement that were publicly known to the outside world. There were those who could fight, those who could resist, those who could support, and those who could support. In other words, as long as you joined and had enough talent, ability, and potential, the higher-ups would clearly arrange everything from grade 1 to grade 5 for you. There were 14 different paths of advancement, and there would always be one that suited you. This was the cohesive force of the big spectrum. Some of the smaller ones didn't even have a complete path of advancement, and there were only a few big cats and small cats, not to mention the special development and research in order to complete the lineage. Without money, land, and people, it was impossible. Most of the savages didn't have the strength of an organization to support them, so they could only blindly buy stigmata, iron, or go to a big organization to buy membership. One wrong step, and there was no way forward, no way back, and they would be stuck in the middle and suffer. If they were not careful, the whole village would have to eat. And now, the souls refined by Crow not only made up for the combat power that Huaishur urgently needed, but also gave him enough room to plan his next path. Whether he continued to work in the Astronomical Association, or simply jumped ship to the Social Security Bureau, or tired of working for others, he would not be stuck in a dead end. As long as it was an attribute stigmata, he could perfectly connect. It was just that this method of implantation was more than a little deceptive. Of course, if there's a chance, I still hope that you can continue to advance in the Abyss Spectrum, Crow suggested. After all, it would be a waste of your potential to choose a random path of advancement. Huaishur pretended not to hear and decided to wait for a period of time until he got used to the stigmata. Then he would choose a more decent path of advancement and work hard. The Abyss Spectrum, at first glance, did not sound like a decent sect. Once it was exposed, he was afraid that everyone would want to beat him up, and he would have to check it later. However, although it sounded scary, it felt very good. He tried to move his body, and under his now pale skin, his tendons stretched and stretched, bursting out with unexpected power. After the end of the developmental period, he thought that his strength had reached the limit, but he did not expect that after the stigmata was implanted, his strength would soar again. It was like a bird gun changing into a cannon. As he moved his body, he heard the bones all over his body rubbing against each other, making a crisp, crackling sound. Huaishur was overjoyed. My realm, is it not far from the tiger leopard thunder? This can only mean one thing. Crow looked at him with pity. You have slept for too long, and your back is stiff. You should change to a better mattress. Although it is true that your physique has advanced. Huaishur was speechless. In short, congratulations to you, Huaishur, for your successful advancement. Congratulations. Crow tilted his head and looked at him, saying seriously, from the beginning, humans have thirsted for power. People with reasons thirst for power, and people without reasons will also thirst for power. In the end, power is like money. It is one of the necessary currencies to survive in this world. So, now that you have power, what are you going to do? What do you mean? Huaishur was at a loss. If you want to say it, it's probably about life ideals or something. Crow replied, although everyone has different reasons for seeking power, life after obtaining power is like a chain of idioms. No matter how you start, in the end, it will become a boring range of do whatever you want, do whatever you want, do whatever you want, do whatever you want, and so on. So, how do you plan to use this power? Huaishur thought seriously and asked tentatively, is money and beautiful women okay? Huh. Crow was amused, patting Huaishur's shoulder vigorously, and praised from the bottom of his heart. You are really a contented person. Then, ruling the world? Crow nodded. That will require effort. What about immortality? Isn't that too hard? Crow said, not only to seek the path of immortality, but also to live a slow life after achieving immortality. Look at the gods in the past. Even if they only had 1,000 years of life, didn't they still go crazy or die? There were not many who died of old age. From beginning to end, Crow did not seem to be opposed to Huaishi's goals, and did not even show any signs of you are thinking too much. It is impossible to achieve. It was as if impossible did not exist. Huaishi thought for a long time and asked softly, then, what about living a happy life? Crow was silent. After a long time, she sighed in pity. It will be difficult, she said. Huaishi, it will be very difficult. More difficult than immortality, more troublesome than ruling the world, more extravagant than money and beautiful women. The so-called happy life was something that only existed in dreams. Then I will try. Huaishi laughed. If it is difficult, then there is value in working hard, right? However, the current priority was not this. It was how to solve the current chaos in Xian Hai and how to kill that starred Qi Yuan to vent his anger. Listening to the roar in the distance and the dark ripples that faintly covered the entire city, Huaishi cracked his neck, waved his arms, and lifted the axe on his shoulder. Okay, after I kill Qi Yuan and the bunch of crazy people, I will come back and slowly think about how to live a happy life. He looked around and asked, did you see where that starred went? I saw him. Crow showed a smile that made him uneasy. How about I give you a ride? Chapter 84. Wait. Huaishi subconsciously raised his hand to object, only to see Crow throw over a full travel bag. Take it. Use it on the road. What is this? He subconsciously caught it, not paying attention for a moment. In the next moment, Huaishi slipped. A big hole appeared under Huaishi's feet. With a scream, he fell into the darkness. The Special Affairs Department, which had regained its silence, was silent again. How tragic. Not even chickens and dogs were left. Crow spread its wings, swept over the messy dungeon, went up the stairs, flew over the silent hall full of wreckage, and landed on the roof of the Special Affairs Department. It looked up at the dark pillars of smoke that were invisible to the naked eye. Looking down from the sky, through the layers of camouflage and the turbulent power hidden in the dark, Crow's crimson eyes revealed the true appearance of everything. Like a flying bird, a huge shadow slowly spread out like a tide, covering the entire city. 9 ferocious heads pointed in different directions, devouring the sacrifices offered everywhere in the city, as if returning to the egg. Hibernating in the darkness, nurturing changes from hell. 9 phoenixes? How interesting. She laughed softly. Should I say they are determined or brainless? But in the end, it's all for naught. No one responded. The stage was ready, and the giant curtain was pulled open. The real show was about to begin. But who would be the protagonist this time? Huaishi felt himself falling in the darkness. The wind whistled, and after an unknown amount of time, he finally sat on the ground. Before he could get up, he felt a strong wind blowing against his face, and a heavy iron whip hovered in front of him. It was close at hand. Huaishi's hair stood on end. Who is it? Huaishi looked at the iron whip and saw a burly man standing in front of him. His left arm was broken at the shoulder, and his face was pale, but his eyes seemed to be on fire, covered in blood vessels. Big brother, don't shoot. It's me. Huaishi subconsciously raised his hands, but felt that something was wrong halfway through his words, and quickly corrected himself. It's an ally. We're allies. The bearded man looked at him coldly. The iron whip hovered in front of him, motionless. It was as if the slightest movement would directly stab him to death. He could feel a chilling, killing intent from the other party. Looking at the strange, badly mutilated corpse behind the burly man, one could tell that his killing intent was real. Even though they were separated by a few inches, the pressure from the iron whip was so heavy that it was as if it had materialized and pressed down heavily on his shoulder, causing him to be almost unable to move as sweat poured down his back. "Well, I can explain astronomy society?" the burly man asked first. Huaishir was stunned. That's right. How did you know?" The burly man glanced at his bag, which had fallen earlier than Huaishir's. Someone had thoughtfully pinned his work card for the Astronomy Society on the seal of the bag. The name, age, and photo stickers were used to indicate one's identity, just like a blind date, so as to prevent friendly fire. That was 2F** King Sweet. It would be even better if the landing method was more stable. Why sure, right? He looked at the harmless and innocent face of a youth in front of him, and his expression became more and more unhappy. "You're the local ascender in the report. I know you." Huaishir didn't know whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. "Who are you?" "Social Security Bureau's Special Operations Department, Third Order, Jinmu." After confirming Huaishir's identity, he slowly put away his whip and pulled out a metal emblem from his pocket. The emblem was imprinted with Jinmu's origin substance fluctuations and his military rank using alchemy techniques that could not be faked. After going through AI change training, Huaishir at least knew how to verify the authenticity of the emblem. After confirming that it was authentic, he hurriedly returned it with both hands. "Sorry for the disrespect. Come with me." He obviously didn't have a good impression of Huaishir. He took the emblem and lifted the iron whip with one arm, once again walking in front. "Just don't drag me down." It was not until now that Huaishir had the time to take a closer look at the surroundings. They seemed to be underground in a huge tunnel. There were traces of excavation everywhere. With the flickering light above their heads, they could see the traces of fighting everywhere. It was obvious that there had been a fierce battle, and when Huaishir took a step forward, he stepped on a broken rail. Railway? Huaishir was stunned for a moment before he reacted. Subway? Combining the scene with the surroundings, he could almost determine where he was. No, if he thought about it carefully, if the returned pure people really wanted to cause trouble, there was no doubt that the subway line in Exine High, which had been dug for years, was the most convenient place, right? He held his bag in one hand and the manual given to him by Crow in the other. He followed behind Jinmu. "Where are we going?" Jinmu walked in front and said without turning his head, "To find my partner, Shunyu, and your superior, Ai Ching." Huaishir was stunned. Jinmu said, "Before I was dragged down, I saw him grab the inspector. They should be together." "Oh." Huaishir nodded. Then he took the opportunity to lower his head and continue to flip through the manual in his hand. He nodded from time to time and clicked his tongue in wonder. In the end, Jinmu turned around and frowned. "What are you looking at?" "The manual." Huaishir closed the manual in his hand and stuffed it into his pocket. "After looking at it for a long time, I have a rough understanding of it. Next time, I'll have to ask her to prepare an idiot's version for me. There are too many long explanations." He put down the travel bag in his hand and took a deep breath. "Wait for me. Let me try." Then he got into a horse stance, clenched his fists, and hummed. He tried his best to encourage himself. His face was red, but no matter how you looked at it, he looked like he was constipated. Jinmu was confused. There was a long and awkward silence. "Sorry, I'm not in a good condition." Huaishir coughed awkwardly. "Let's continue." Jinmu looked at him indifferently for a long time. Then he retracted his gaze and turned forward. But as soon as he took a step, his arms seemed to have no bones. He pulled the iron whip and stabbed it behind him. He blocked the axe that was chopping down from behind. He slowly turned around and stared at the slightly stunned teenager. His expression was gloomy. "Are you crazy? You have to believe that this is a misunderstanding." Huaishir looked at the axe in his hand and took a step back awkwardly. "I originally planned to let you die painlessly, but since I've been discovered, there's nothing I can do." He grinned, twisted his neck, and stretched his muscles and bones that were stiff from being trapped in the cage for a long time. With a crackling sound, wisps of gray flames slowly emerged from under the clothes in front of his chest, igniting his skin inch by inch. Soon, in addition to the pale fire of origin in his hands, his whole body was shrouded in gray, gloomy flames. In the dancing flames, everything seemed to become blurred. It was impossible to tell whether it was a substance or an illusion. It was faint, as if it had melted into the darkness. And in front of his chest, the vortex-like crack slowly rotated, like the furnace in the deepest part of hell. It was glowing. Stigmata, ghost, activate. Although I'm very grateful for you telling me so much, let's stop here. In the shroud of flames, the teenager who looked like a devil smiled. So, do you want me to stab you to death first and then do an autopsy, or obediently take off this fake face and let me see your true face? I've been discovered. At that moment, Jean Moo's cold expression stiffened. The corners of his mouth slowly curled up, revealing an exaggerated and unnatural smile. His mouth almost stretched to the root of his ears. Then, from his mouth, a thick black liquid slowly gushed out, emitting a foul smell. The liquid was almost boiling and rolling, making a sticky sound. What did I do wrong? To tell you the truth, when the stigmata was activated, I thought there was something wrong with my eyes. Huaisher carried the axe in his hand and pointed at his iron-gray eyes. In the reflection of his eyes, Jean Moo in front of him had been completely torn apart, showing signs of decay. For a long time, in the corpse-like shell, a thick purple-black liquid was flowing, revealing its original appearance. This was what Huaisher saw the moment the stigmata was activated. Fortunately, the instruction manual was detailed enough. But even so, Huaisher found it hard to believe that there was a border mutant that could even disguise the fluctuations of origin. Now it seemed that he could even obtain part of his memory, which was really surprising. Unfortunately, it stinks. Huaisher whispered softly. If you take me to other places, I'm afraid I won't suspect you. He sniffed the gradually thickening stench in the air. The smell of rotting corpses and blood mixed together, making him feel nauseous. Anyway, here it's enough. The ghostly thing turned its neck almost 180 degrees and looked back in the direction they had been going. In the darkness, a pair of blood-red eyes slowly lit up. Soon, one deformed creature after another crawled out of the darkness. Some of them looked like humans, but their bones were deformed and their hair had fallen off. Some looked like wild dogs and cats, but their bodies were shockingly large, like lions. There was also a bunch of rat-like, ghostly things. As the ghostly thing disguised as Jean Moo screamed, the dozen or so deformed corrosive creatures crawling on the ground slowly moved forward. Some of them directly lay on the ceiling of the tunnel, dripping stinky saliva and landing at Huaisher's feet. Last question. Huaisher looked at the monsters around him awkwardly, raised his finger, and asked, "Do you border mutants have a habit of looking for psychiatrists?" No one responded. As the mutated Jean Moo screamed, the ghostly thing surrounded him, and the stench hit him in the face. It seemed that there was no such thing. What a pity. But for Huaisher, it seemed to be just right. He could try the stigmata talent recommended by Crow in the manual. It seemed to be called at that moment. As Huaisher opened his arms, the fire of ashes covering his body instantly spread in all directions, turning into a thin and eye-catching rust-colored fog. Shrouded in the fog, endless fear broke out in an instant, invading every consciousness that had the ability to think. It mixed the pain, sorrow, and fear extracted from countless deaths into one, and suddenly burst out from the deepest part of the consciousness. Screams of fear suddenly sounded, and at that moment, from the rust-colored fog, a pair of burning eyes slowly raised, and a smile appeared on the corner of the mouth. This was the core talent of the stigmata spirit, with a radius of 3 meters. Fear Halo. Chapter 85. In fact, the ghost was a support-type stigmata. Really? Anyway, that was what the manual said. Its talent was to generously share the source substance possessed by the user with the people around it. It was a selfless contribution, but what was shared in the past wasn't anything good. After combining with Huaisher, who had been transformed into a negative energy production machine, what was shared and spread became the ash and death aura that Huaisher himself had extracted from countless death records. Just as Crow had once said, this was the enhanced power of the Gold Collection V2.0 version. Once the ghost was activated, there was no need to touch it. as long as it was within 3 meters of Huaishur. The negative energy that was so dense that it condensed in a substance would generously and enthusiastically give everyone a hug. Just like the calculation method in a certain board game, you would need to calculate according to the basic values of both sides, add in the basic values and other complicated factors, and then make a round of exemption judgment. If the judgment failed, you would feel pain in the endless death aura. For sublimators who surpassed Huaishur by 4 levels, this might just be a breeze on the face. For sublimators who surpassed Huaishur by 2 levels, they began to feel uncomfortable. For opponents of the same level, this was an inescapable horror and nightmare. Now it seemed that the difference between the two sides isn't that big. Huaishur whistled, raised his foot, and suddenly stepped on the corrosive object falling from the ceiling. He looked down at its screaming and hissing appearance and asked curiously, "Did you get a heat stroke?" The next moment, the axe of wrath slashed down. Stinky blood splattered. Heart poison spread. From the corpse, a viscous liquid let out a sharp scream and quickly condensed, bulging like a hedgehog with long needles, and then fell apart. It turned into a cloud of dust. Huaishur nodded approvingly. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, this was a good thing. Then, he raised his head and stared at Fury Kinmu, who was holding the border relic in his hand, and asked curiously, "Do you know how to use that thing?" What answered him was Fury's iron whip. Even if it wasn't released, just crudely using the source substance to push, the violent power carried by the iron whip knocked a deep crack in the ground. The hurricane spread, almost tearing apart the ash fog around Huaishur. But in the next moment, the fog closed again. Huaishur, who had slid backwards, steadied himself. Feeling the terrifying wind pressure exerted on his body at that moment, he could not help but whistle. He casually swung his axe at the head of the corruptor that was about to pounce on him. Blood splattered everywhere, and another scream rang out. Feeling the inexplicable throbbing in his chest, Huaishur stretched out his hand and clenched it. The flames of the sealing hand ignited. Amidst the crisp sound of Origin's substance condensing, a black sacrificial blade reappeared in his hand. The sacrificial blade, which had lost its physical form, had turned into Origin's substance. Now Huaishur had reconstructed it from Origin's substance. Huaishur waved the blade in her hand and pulled out her hatchet with her other hand. The blade and hatchet collided, sending sparks and Origin substance flying everywhere. In the ashes of the calamity, the young man grinned happily. "Come," he murmured softly, "let us begin." An instant later, the ghosts howled as they charged forward. It was as if she was flying in the wind, losing her weight in an instant. It was as if she could fly as she wished. Huaishur ran lightly and swiftly in the wind, slashing her blade at the subway whip that was sweeping in front of her. Iron and steel collided. Meanwhile, his body borrowed the iron whip's power to soar into the air, stepping on the heavy iron whip. He began to circle around this single plank bridge like a bird circling in the wind. The blade and axe slashed through the air, leaving behind a trail of cold light that resembled a crescent moon. The blade slammed into Jinmu's body, as if it had struck metal. Sparks flew everywhere, but only a small crack appeared on his neck. Air Lies Stigmata was a permanent effect. Even if it was not activated, the user's body would maintain a certain degree of toughness. Even a small caliber bullet might not be able to damage it. It was as indestructible as steel. Unfortunately, it was only steel in the end. In an instant, countless overlapping high-pitched sounds rang out at this moment. The dual blade technique from the Theravada esoteric sect was displayed in Huaishur's hands. Even without the dual blades, just the blade and axe in his hands had reached a terrifying speed. The origin substance of the steel and the origin substance of the steel overlapped, tearing the wind and setting off a sharp howl. It reached a terrifying speed that Huaishur could not reach in the past. After an instant, Huaishur landed from the iron whip, while Jinmu staggered back. His exposed chest, neck, and even his face and facial features were all covered in dense cracks. The border mutant hidden behind this excellent body screamed angrily. The iron whip in his hand slammed into the ground under his feet, almost setting off a terrifying wave that was like an earthquake. A hurricane swept through. It pulled the iron whip in its hand and lashed around randomly, destroying everything around it into wreckage. The corners of Huaishi's eyes twitched wildly. He was sure that even if his physique had advanced, he would be smashed into a pile of meat paste if he was hit. Whether it was the third stage stigmata air, Lai's amazing strength, or the terrifying weight of the border relic itself, it was not something that a first-stage novice like him could resist. That was why he really envied these berserkers. After moving his numb fingers, Huaishi once again unsheathed the blade and axe in his hand. Again, it was as if it was dancing against a speeding train. The wind howled. Compared to the original attack against Huaishi, this kind of crazy state after losing its mind was even more difficult to deal with. There are always tricks to figure out when fighting back and forth. With such fierce power, if he did not follow the routine, it would be easy to kill an old master with random punches. Not to mention a novice. The closer he got, the more suffocating he felt. The wind pressure was so heavy that even the ground under his feet became turbulent. It was impossible to trust, like trying to maintain balance after getting into a hamster ball. Once he slipped, he would be sucked into the storm that had turned into a meat grinder. Not even his bones would be left. When he was close, he could even hear the sound of the viscous liquid boiling in Jinmu's body. It began to become anxious, no, uneasy. The aura of fear began to take effect, imperceptibly. In a sudden burst of a sharp whistle, Huaishi suddenly leaned to the side, feeling as if a building had collapsed in front of him, followed by the iron whip that was almost smashing down on the tip of his nose. Then the blade and axe chopped down. He roared with all his might, the flames in his hand holding the axe burning vigorously, constantly transforming the origin substance into the weight of steel, adding it to the chop. The high-pitched sound of metal rubbing against metal burst out of nowhere. Jinmu's only arm suddenly shook, and then a little finger flew from the iron whip and fell, revealing the bones that had mutated into the color of steel. Broken finger. Then, as the blade of the axe and the iron whip collided, the sound of a large bell roared in his ears. Huaishi's vision almost turned black, and he lost his hearing in the loud sound. He quickly retreated, only to see that the blade of the axe that he was so proud of had cracked open. What kind of thing was that border relic? It was at least grade A or above. It had only relied on its own mass and origin substance to break his axe, but it was unharmed. Huaishi secretly clicked his tongue and staggered, almost being sucked into the storm of iron whips sweeping over. The roar was too exaggerated, and even his semicircular canals were faintly injured. Fortunately, his body, strengthened by the stigmata, had a weak regenerative ability, and this kind of small injury that was not even enough to cause internal bleeding was completely healed in just a few seconds. And after losing a little finger, the corroded body with only one arm could no longer hold the iron whip tightly. More and more holes and flaws were exposed. And from Huaishi's point of view, it was as if the door was open and the door was being warmly received. Welcome. His palm brushed roughly across the axe of wrath, mending the crack, and once again closed his body, facing the iron whip that was slashing at him. He suddenly leaned to the side, and the sacrificial knife in his hand was suddenly thrown out with a wave of his arm. The sacrificial knife that left his hand could not even injure Jinmu's body, and after heavily slashing his face, it flew back into the darkness behind him. But then, Huaishi's palm suddenly tightened, and he retreated. Come back. The thin wire tied to the handle of the knife quickly expanded and multiplied, showing the color of steel. As the blade of the knife coiled around the corroded body's body, the thin wire expanded to the thickness of a little finger, and under Huaishi's pull, the steel cable contracted inwards. As the steel cable contracted, dazzling sparks unexpectedly appeared on the corroded body's body. However, the instant restraint had already caused the corroded body's movements to stiffen for a moment. Then, Huaishi was already close at hand. From midair, He chopped the blade of the axe at Jinmu's hand that was holding the iron whip. Bang! A rumbling sound accompanied by a wave of air spread out again. This time, his thumb was cut off cleanly and flew into the air. The iron whip left his hand. The corroded body was furious and struggled with all its might, causing the origin substance rope to wail and fall apart. Huaishur felt a dull pain in his head, but his movements did not stop at all. The returning sacrificial knife flew into his hand, rubbing against the blade of the axe, bursting with sparks and stinging the corroded body's eyes. Countless sharp cries burst out, overlapping in one place. It was like a rotating cutter cutting into steel head-on. Accompanied by a loud noise, blazing sparks burst out from the remnants of the knife and axe. The heart poison burned on the blade of the axe left a trail in the air like a crescent moon. In the blink of an eye, it overlapped dozens of times. In the end, the knife and axe split apart in Huaishur's roar, leaving a tragic cross-shaped wound on Jinmu's chest. In the wound, the boiling darkness let out a scream of fear. "See you again." The sacrificial knife pierced into the viscous liquid, deeply wedged into the viscous body of the border mutant. In the next moment, the heart poison burst out. A tragic scream sounded from the viscous liquid. Then it stopped abruptly. Silence came abruptly. In front of Huaishur, Jinmu, who had lost his strength, slowly knelt on the ground. In his open chest, viscous liquid that turned into ashes flew out. Thank you." In that moment, Huaishur heard an illusory murmur. When he lowered his head, he saw that Jinmu's cracked face seemed to have a smile of relief. "You're still alive?" He could not believe it. After being parasitized by the border mutant for so long, he still did not die. How terrifying was this guy's vitality? But now, he should be an arrow at the end of its flight, right? He sighed, raised the axe in his hand, and clenched his hands tightly. "Sorry," he said, "for turning into a corroded body after you die." He did not finish the sentence, but Jinmu understood. There was no fear or anger. He closed his eyes and used the last of his strength to raise his head. The golden color on his neck slowly faded. "Go! North!" A hoarse voice came out from his broken throat. "Shouldn't you? Please! You still care about your companion until the end? Where the hell did you come from? You're such a good person." Huaishur lowered his eyes in pity. "Okay." The blade of the axe flashed. The headless corpse fell to the ground and slowly turned into ashes under the erosion of the ashes. Huaishur quietly watched him disappear from this world. After a long time, he turned around and walked into the depths of the darkness, in the direction of the crazy screams. The ashes burned vigorously. The ghost came out. Chapter 86. This is King Terrible. In the abandoned subway hall, there were corpses everywhere. The people who had been holding a fanatical ceremony here were now dead, along with the mutants from the border. In the middle of the huge sacrificial ceremony, the man in a suit wearing a poly mask sighed unhappily. After looking at the specifications of the sacrificial offering and the symbol on the altar again and again, he finally came to an unpleasant conclusion. "Are you kidding me? It's actually the 9 Phoenix?" According to the records of the Astronomy Association, the 9 Phoenix belonged to the 4th stage of the sacred mark in Dongshia's pedigree. However, this did not mean that it was only slightly more advanced than the sacred marks of foam and air lie. On the contrary, the difference between the 4th and the 3rd stage was like heaven and earth. Once they reached the 3rd stage, the ether level, the fragile internal organs of the sublimata would begin to transform into the legendary creature represented by the sacred mark. It was like the legendary hero who was given dragon's blood, the child of a ghost, or the projection of an angel in the human world. However, the 4th stage, Xingyan, was a complete body. In other words, they could completely transcend from the fragile body of a human and transform into the sacred object represented by the sacred mark. Some of the outstanding ones even had divinity and were regarded as demigods with divine blood flowing in their veins. The symbol of the 9 Phoenix now appeared in the sacrificial ceremony of the people who had been purified. This could only mean one thing. Behind the chaos in Xian High, there was a sublimator who had reached the fourth stage. A genuine monster. Although the path that the Social Security Bureau had grasped did not involve the branch of the Nine Phoenix, and even this advancement path was incomplete. There was only the third stage, Ubuo Bird. However, as a ferocious beast known as the Ghost Chariot, the Nine Phoenix had been rumored to eat human souls since ancient times. Therefore, it was not surprising that it was favored by the rancher. In fact, Yu Dongri's own advancement path also included this branch. After all, Halcyon was also a sacred mark with great versatility, so he naturally knew something about it. Then, what was the Nine Phoenix planning to do here? Or rather, what could it do? If it wanted to cause trouble, there was no doubt that it could do it. It was simply too easy for a fourth-stage sublimator to cause trouble in the present realm. However, the question was there any meaning to it? Even if he wanted to divert the attention of the Social Security Bureau, a Stage 4-9 Phoenix was not qualified. It was meaningless to fight alone, and it was not cost-effective. It was better to gather forces and create a big news story. But obviously, after the pure people had been operating in Xian High for so long under the alias of the Savior Society, they were not there purely to hunt for food. It was too troublesome. This kind of thing could be done easily in a small country that was in the middle of a civil war. Why did they have to come all the way to Dongxia? In that case, his goal was obvious. Or rather, it was always obvious. Shanghai. After the last border catastrophe, the purified people's obsession with Shanghai had increased day by day. It was obvious that there was something in Shanghai that was very important to them. Therefore, the entrance had to be opened. But why? The main characters in such a major event would at least be Tier 5 sublimators, and there might even be natural enemies that would interfere. All sorts of destructive elements would be involved. No matter how strong a fourth-stage sublimator was, they could only wave their flags and shout in the face of such a situation. You're just a Nine Phoenix. What do you have to deserve this? Unless advancement? Yu Dongri finally reacted. He looked at the strange, sacrificial ground in front of him and speculated about the huge mystic ritual that was currently shrouding Xian High. After obtaining the main axis, the originally complicated fog seemed to have dissipated in an instant. It became logical. Yu Dongri hurriedly dug out the subway blueprint that he had originally planned from the work area of the subway station and looked at the perfect ring on it. Then, he dipped his hands in the blood on the ground and kept making marks. In the end, the blood on the entire ring crisscrossed, perfectly weaving two overlapping emblems. One was the symbol of the Nine Phoenix. The other was the symbol of breeding and transformation. As expected, he was advancing. The purpose of this ritual was very clear. Through the proliferation of the mirror realm, the entire Xian High's underground railway line was covered. Using the correspondence between the reflection and the main body, it cleverly bypassed the suppression of the great mystic ritual Zarathustra. And the cost of interfering with the reflection was much lower than the cost of interfering with the main body. Through this method, the depth of the reflection was deepened, creating a hellish area and then covering the main body. The present realm was still the present realm, but it was enough to perform the advancement ritual that could only be performed in the depths of hell. It was a wonderful idea, and through the advancement of the same origin, the moment the advancement was completed, it would resonate with the origin and create a direct passage for the rancher, thus achieving the purpose of opening a path to Demonic City. It was killing two birds with one stone. If one wanted to become a legend, one had to create a legend first. Just like if one wanted to become a god, they had to create miracles first. With one move, he could complete two miracles of the abyss. With one of them advancing and the other becoming his own resource, his future achievements would definitely be limitless, right? When he thought of this, Yu Dongri suddenly heard the sharp sound of glass shattering. Just as he raised his head in shock, he saw that behind the shattered glass, the name of the platform was actually beginning to twist and change. In the end, it became the name of a subway station that he did not recognize at all. Pudong Avenue? Very quickly, he understood. Could it be the name of a place in Demonic City? In other words, the current mirror realm actually used the correspondence of 3 reflections? This final task was becoming more and more troublesome at a speed visible to the naked eye. He pulled at his wig with a headache and lowered his head to look at the watch that still did not change at all. The signal bar on the side was clearly full, which meant that all of this was under the surveillance of the Astronomical Society. But there was still no response from the higher-ups. There were a few possibilities. The first was that the higher-ups already knew about it, but could not provide any help. You were abandoned as a friend and could only wait for death and peace. The second was a more hopeful guess. This matter was not a big deal in the eyes of the higher-ups. With the current preparations in Exine High, it could be solved. So he could do it without worry. No matter which one it was, he was afraid that he would not be able to get any help from the higher-ups. A bunch of bastards. They are not of any use at the crucial moment. He cursed irritably and wandered around the subway station that was littered with corpses to think. After a long time, he stopped, took out his phone from his pocket, and dialed the number of the detective. Who is it? The detective on the other end was listless. Is it the Astronomical Society? Have the people who came to pick me up finally arrived? In your dreams. I haven't even run yet. And you want to run away alone? Yu Dongri was furious. You're still alive? The detective was shocked. I thought you would be sacrificed. You better shut your crow's mouth. Yu Dongri was getting angrier. Okay, let's not talk nonsense. You're the local operator of yesterday's delivery, right? The detective did not say anything. It seemed like he was thinking about how to shirk his responsibility. Yu Dongri snorted and asked with a glimmer of hope. I heard yesterday's delivery service is the highest level. They can even deliver the things you buy to you before you buy them. Is that true? The detective on the other end of the phone was still silent. After a long time, he said with a dry voice, 5 minutes ago, I received a notice from the general manager of yesterday's delivery service in Jinling. He said that the item ordered by a customer has been delivered to the local destination. He asked me to remind the customer to check the receipt. This service fee will be calculated according to the highest standard and will be paid in full by the Jinling Social Security Bureau. Yu Dongri was stunned. What the hell? Before he finished his sentence, his phone rang. A text message popped up. The delivery service provided to you this time has ended. Please reply to the text message later to comment on this service. If you're satisfied, please. There was no need to continue the call. Yu Dongri hung up the phone in shock. He slowly turned around and looked around. There was no storage cabinet. Finally, his eyes fell on the huge altar made of solid wood in the center of the layers of corpses. Unbelievable. After a long time, he picked up a steel bar from the ground and walked around the altar that was engraved with layers of gorgeous patterns. He couldn't see any cracks. When he used all his strength to break through the outer layer of the wooden board and pried open the altar, he saw a huge iron box covered in dust in the middle of the altar. When did this happen? This altar had been here for who knows how long. How did they open the altar and then close it back up the same way after the items went in? Or, from the beginning, when the altar was built, yesterday's delivery service stuffed this thing inside? He couldn't figure out at all. But the logo of yesterday's delivery service proved the identity of this delivery service without a doubt. I take back my words. Those bastards at the top are still useful occasionally. At least they can pay the bills. He struggled to break the lock on the outside and open the heavy and huge iron box. Looking at the densely packed alchemy explosives, a happy smile appeared on his face. This operation was in the bag. Help! Help! In the continuous gunshots, Shinyu shrank in the corner. He closed his eyes and kept pulling the trigger, but the result was that he couldn't hit the target at all. Shut up, trash. You're so annoying. AI Ching angrily reprimanded. She skillfully reloaded the submachine gun in her hand and then pulled the trigger at the group of corrosives. Aren't you a rank 3 ascendant? Why are you letting a cripple like me fight? Hurry up and attack. But I don't know how to fight at all. Shinyu shrunk his head and timidly replied, I only know how to play healer. Jin Mu is the one fighting. I only need to be responsible for healing. Trash. AI Ching no longer held any hope for this cowardly fellow. She gritted her teeth and removed the last grenade from his vest. She tossed it into the midst of the swarm of corrosives. Following a loud explosion, a thick, black blood spread out. The stench was pungent, but the remaining dozen or so wild dogs seemed to have been aroused and became more and more excited. This time, they became more cautious, cautiously keeping a distance and carefully wandering around, looking for an opportunity. They were like hyenas preparing to hunt, extremely cunning. The flashlight in Xunyu's hand had already begun to flicker. It was difficult to work in the gradually increasing concentration of abyss sediment. It wasn't just the flashlight that was being corroded. AI Qing's face paled, and she panted violently, but her expression was still calm. She looked at the hungry monsters coldly, her fingers slowly tapping the body of the gun. Until that moment, the light was completely extinguished. In the darkness, the scarlet eyes of the dozen or so patrol shuttles suddenly glowed with excitement and surrounded her amidst hissing sounds. AI Qing pulled the trigger, and in the midst of the noise, a roar suddenly rang out. AI Qing, don't be afraid. I'm coming to save you. In the next instant, the flashlight lit up again, and the burning Huai sure broke through the wall. Then he froze in place. What happened? Chapter 87. The original plan was perfect. AI Qing encountered enemies. AI Qing was in danger. Huaishe descended from the sky. Huaishe killed all the monsters. Huaishe saved the damsel in distress. AI Qing was safe, and AI Qing's favorability increased. It should have been like this. What exactly was the problem? Huaishe looked around her in shock. The ground was littered with monster carcasses, and blood splattered everywhere. She calmly tossed aside the submachine gun that had missed its target and pulled out a sword that was almost as long as a nail from her walking stick. She plunged it straight into the skull of the last hyena. Something didn't seem right. He froze in place, looking at the scene in front of him in shock in the silence. Then he turned his head stiffly, took a few steps back, and walked back behind the wall. It's an illusion, an illusion. The way I opened it just now wasn't right. Let's do it again. He turned around again, took a deep breath, and jumped out. AI Qing, I'll save. The scene still didn't change. The only thing that changed was AI Qing's pitiful and cold gaze, as if she was looking at an idiot. What's going on? He scratched his head blankly. Since when did the inspector's combat power become so fierce? Or was AI Qing hiding her strength and was actually a master of the masters of the masters? Huaishe felt a chill at the back of his head when he saw the sword that he had used on the spur of the moment. It wasn't until he got rid of the awkwardness and focused on the girl in front of him that he realized that something was wrong. She was standing steadily, but her posture was abnormally strange and stiff. Even if it was perfectly in line with mechanics, no ordinary person would choose to stand like this. It felt awkward no matter how he looked at it. It was like a machine. It's a machine, no mistake. As usual, AI Qing spoke in a mind-reading manner. She raised her hand and lifted the hem of her dress slightly, revealing the steel structure around her ankles and the thin structure that extended upward from her calves. It was like a piece of foil that clung to her skin. The slender blood vessels seemed to glow with something, faintly shining through the pale skin. Sticky blood slowly dripped from the cracked skin on his knees and toes. It was like stepping on the tip of a knife. She stood in front of Huaishe. It's just an emergency response bracket. Don't act like you haven't seen the world, okay? She waved the blood dripping from her wrist and nonchalantly tore off a piece of her skirt to bandage her wound. Huaishe didn't know what to say for a moment. He scratched his head awkwardly. Why haven't I seen such a high-level thing before? The experimental model of the technical department studio hasn't been mass-produced yet. I can be considered as an internal test mouse. AI Qing manipulated the assistance app in her phone to minimize the sudden increase in values. She turned off the aiming module and the counterattack module. Her wildly beating heart finally calmed down, and bruises gradually appeared on her arms and ankles. The abnormal color on his face faded, revealing a pale complexion. She looked at Huaishe's fully armed appearance and raised her eyebrows slightly. Speaking of which, it's all thanks to a certain someone being locked up in prison. At the critical moment, I couldn't even find a reliable fighter. I could only apply for one at the last minute just in case. I'm really sorry for causing trouble. Can you not pursue this matter? After losing the opportunity to be a hero and save the damsel in distress, Huaishir was like a salted fish. Besides, didn't I just break out of prison and come over to save you? Something happened to the Special Affairs Division? Yes. Huaishir thought for a long time, not knowing how to explain the tragic situation to her. Fortunately, AI Ching had already understood what he meant. After thinking for a moment, she frowned. So, is there a problem with Qi Yuan? Yes. This was the good thing about talking to AI Ching. She understood immediately and never had to worry about it. After the two of them talked about the situation, Huaishir could finally throw this pile of trivial matters to AI Ching. And he finally saw Shun Yu, who was huddled in the corner and trembling. Who's this? The reinforcements of the local ascendant. Although he's a rank 3, he doesn't seem to be of any use. She looked back at Shun Yu and sighed. In the end, she didn't say anything excessive. After all, his support had at least helped her a lot. When he introduced himself, Shun Yu reluctantly squeezed out a smile. But when Huaishir pulled the rope and dragged the iron whip behind him, Shun Yu's expression completely darkened. He sat on the ground and didn't speak anymore. Obviously, the news of Jin Mu's death was a big blow to him. What's next? What do you plan to do? AI Ching suddenly asked. Yes. Huaishir looked at her in confusion. It was the first time he heard her ask for his opinion. He didn't know what she meant. Strictly speaking, you're no longer an official employee of the Astronomy Society. You don't need to be responsible for the Social Security Bureau and the Special Affairs Division. Even if you're in a state of prison break, this is caused by irresistible factors. You're free. Why sure, even if it's only for now. AI Ching looked at him solemnly. No matter what decision you make, I'm no longer qualified to give you orders. This was already an obvious hint. Whether he chose to let go or simply leave, it was a normal choice. A person had a legitimate reason to protect their own life. He had no obligation to participate in this battle. Huaishir thought for a long time and couldn't help but laugh. But this doesn't stop me from wanting to chop that grandson Qi Yuan into pieces, right? AI Ching looked at him calmly. If she wanted to say something, her gaze was as if she was looking at an idiot. After a long time, she sighed, took out her phone, and took a photo of Huaishir's face, saving his confused look. The upload was complete. Then, Huaishir, in the name of the International Astronomy Society, I announced that in order to ensure the safety of the present world, you've been recruited. AI Ching turned off her phone, took out a box from her pocket, and threw it into his arms. This is for you. Huaishir curiously held the palm-sized aluminum box and shook it curiously. What's this? Is it popular to give me gifts recently? Paige's 10th anniversary figurine. AI Ching said expressionlessly. Don't you like Paige? Take it back home and burn 2 sticks of incense in the morning and night. Let it bless you with a smooth journey. What's this? Huaishir opened the box in shock and found that it wasn't a pink hairdryer. He was relieved. In the middle of the black flannel was a silver-white bracelet. The flat surface was engraved with dark lines. It didn't look like a magical ancient spell, but more like some kind of circuit integration. It was between ancient and novel, making it difficult to evaluate its style. A new handcuff? He curiously picked up the bracelet and clasped it on his left wrist. The inner layer of the bracelet made a small cracking sound. It tightened, but the strength was just right. When he repeated the action of opening his 5 fingers and then clenching his fist twice, the bracelet on his wrist unfolded as if it was disassembled. Pieces of iron embedded with each other, covered, and extended upwards. In the end, it completely covered the back of his hand, turning into a light, fingerless glove. It was clearly made of steel, but it didn't restrict his movements at all. It didn't hinder him from holding a knife. His palm felt like it had been pricked by a needle. There was a faint pain, but he soon couldn't feel it. There seemed to be some kind of strange origin substance structure in it, like a stigmata, but Huaishir couldn't distinguish it. The palm of the glove seemed to be fur or some kind of sandpaper. Huaisha tried to rub his hand and heard the sound of iron rubbing against each other. It's a cornerstone produced by the Cavendish workshop. AI Ching said. It extracts the user's blood and origin substance to strengthen it, achieving a qualitative change. You'll know when you try it. Huaisha curiously summoned his sacrificial knife. He stretched out his hand and brushed it across the blade. His palm felt as if it had been cut by the knife. The cornerstone glove was extracting his blood, but as he rubbed it across his palm, the sacrificial knife began to glow with a faint layer of electricity. When he casually swung the knife, the sound of electricity tearing through the air could be heard. When the knife sliced through the remains of the monster on the ground, the incision on the blade was immediately scorched black. It quickly collapsed downwards, turning into ashes that scattered in the wind. It seems to suit you quite well. AI Ching's eyebrows jumped slightly, expressing her satisfaction with this result. The specific effects will depend on how much origin substance you put in and the quality of your blood. If the stigmata evolves, the effects might be even better, right? In any case, no matter what, it's still better than stupidly swinging a knife around. Huaisha examined the cornerstone glove on his left hand in amazement, repeatedly experimenting with its effects. The more he tested it out, the more convenient it became. Not only could it perfectly stack with the heart poison, but the heart poison's attack on origin substances was different. The layer of electricity on the blade was a real physical attack. Carrying it with him was equivalent to being able to turn a normal weapon into an alchemy product with border characteristics at any time. It could be said that it was quite suitable for him. As for how long it could last, the electricity could last for about a minute after a round of refinement. For Huaisha, who leaned towards close combat, this was more than enough time. Thank you. He accepted this gift with satisfaction. In any case, it's something that I was going to sell at a low price. If it can be used in your hands, it could be considered to have created some value. AI Ching didn't say much about its origins. She only waved her hand. We've talked too much already. You should get to work, Huaisha. What about you? Doing my job? She didn't stand on ceremony as she rummaged through the travel bag Huaisha had brought over, replenishing her magazines and weapons. When she saw that there was actually a small female bulletproof vest inside, she couldn't help but look at Huaisha with some astonishment. She didn't expect him to be so considerate. In response, Huaisha could only put on a guilty smile, indicating that this was a gift from him and that she didn't need to be polite. Then, I wish you success in your operation. AI Ching looked at him one last time and couldn't help but have a headache. After all, this guy didn't look like he would have a smooth journey no matter how she looked at him. No, it should be said that she felt like he would die very quickly, right? Just bring this guy along. She suddenly stretched out her hand and pointed at the autistic Shunyu. Although he's a bit of trash, he's still a third-level ascendant. He can at least be of some use. Shunyu raised his head in astonishment. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't refuse. Instead, he took the initiative to carry Huaisha's bag and other miscellaneous items. In the end, he carried the iron whip that Jinmu had left behind on his back. His face was pale as he panted. It seemed that he was becoming more and more unreliable. AI Ching rubbed his head and didn't say anything else. He just lowered his head and waved at them. In short, have a safe journey. She looked down at the instrument in her hand and turned to walk into the darkness. Chapter 88. Ground Command calling Captain Tom. Ground Command calling Captain Tom. In the darkness, two figures slowly moved forward. One of them was carrying an excessively long iron whip on his back. His head was lowered and sweat fell on his blackened shirt. The other person, on the other hand, looked like he was on a spring outing. He walked in a carefree manner, shaking his head from side to side. He even had earphones in his ears, and he was singing along with the background music. You've done well. Now the media wants to know which team you support. The slightly off-key singing echoed in the eerie darkness, and it caused a series of small noises. The sound of bats flapping their wings kept coming. But when he turned back to look at the pale-faced Shinyu, he could not help but sigh. He turned back and walked forward, tiptoed, and put his arm around Shen Yu's shoulder. Don't look so sad, big brother. Huaisher waved his fist. Xin High depends on us to save it. A stage 1 sublimator and a stage 3 trash. Can you really save them? Shen Yu glanced at him weakly. This is not a spring outing. I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm, but can you at least give me some peace before I die? Okay, I know you're sad. Huaisher sighed. He reached into the large hole in his chest and then took out 2 bottles of happy water that were cold enough to freeze one's heart in the darkness. Come, big brother, Hokuoluo. This was also something that Crow had stuffed into her bag. Putting something like this among a pile of bullets and grenades, he really didn't know what she was thinking. She probably didn't know what Huaisher was thinking either. It had to be said that the other benefits of this thing aside, this function of the refrigerator was amazing. Relying on Huaisher's body temperature, the Kuoluo seemed to have calmed Shen Yu down slightly. After drinking half of the bottle, he raised his sleeve to wipe his face. Sorry, I've made a fool of myself. He forced a smile. I've been afraid of fighting since I was young. After I became a sublimator, I could only be a support. Before this, it was Jin Mu who took care of me. He said, if not for Jin Mu, I would have died a long time ago. Speaking of Jin Mu, his eyes reddened again. After all, they had been partners for many years. In his heart, Jin Mu definitely had a special place. Is that so? Huaisher scratched his head. No wonder he was worried about you even before he died. Shen Yu was silent for a long time before she asked anxiously, before he died? It was easy. Huaisher didn't wait for him to finish and said, I did it myself. There's no pain. Shen Yu's shoulders drooped as she said dryly, thank you. Huaisher sighed and took out Jin Mu's insignia from his pocket, stuffing into his hand. Then shows a backbone, big brother. He was a class 3 sublimator after all. He trusted you for so many years. Now that he's dead, don't let him be humiliated again. Shen Yu hurriedly grasped the emblem in her hand, as if she was afraid that she would drop it. She carefully stuffed it into her pocket. However, in response to Huaisher's encouragement, his expression became even more bitter. I'll try my best. Even if he was a complete support, at least he had basic shooting training and physical fitness. The bonus brought by the Class 3 stigmata made his physique more than twice that of Huaisher's. Now he was carrying a travel bag on his back, holding 2 submachine guns in his hands, and full of magazines and grenades. He looked a bit like a suicide squad. But no matter how you looked at it, he looked like he was ready to rush into a crowd of people and blow them up. Huaisher shook his head and didn't want to discourage him. But if they walked along the 11th road like this, it would take them a few hours to reach their destination. Just as they passed by a temporarily excavated maintenance station, Huaisher's footsteps paused for a moment. He saw something covered under the dust-proof cloth next to the junk pile and was immediately delighted. Wait a minute, we have a ride. As he spoke, he jumped off the tracks and went into the maintenance station. Soon, there was a chaotic sound of collapsing, and a manual rail car used by maintenance personnel was pushed out. Under the combined efforts of the two of them, it was smoothly stuck on the track. It fit seamlessly. Fortunately, the times were improving. The car here wasn't like the manual rail car that appeared in the American mines in the traditional animation. There were even handlebars and wheels welded on it. Although they couldn't find gasoline for a while, they could still use their feet to pedal it. And just as Huaisher was walking around the rail car in amazement, Shen Yu couldn't help but gulp and point to the depths of the maintenance station where pairs of scarlet eyes were awakened by the noise. Are we going to be in trouble? Don't be afraid. Don't we have a car? Huaisher took the lead and jumped onto the car, waving to him. Hurry up, pedal it. As long as we're fast enough, their question marks won't be able to catch up. Before he finished speaking, the collapsed pile of junk exploded with a bang, revealing a big hole in the wall behind and a tide of rats surging like a tide. But where had they seen such rats? They were practically the size of wild dogs, and each of them had festering abscesses on their bodies. They were emaciated and let out ear-piercing shrieks of thirst. The gray tide surged, revealing the jagged bones at the bottom of the tide. Countless red eyes stared fixedly at them, and in the next moment, The crazy rat swarm rushed towards them. At this time, Shinyu was no longer entangled with the question of what to do. He didn't need Huaishi's urging at all. He jumped onto the rail car and began to pedal with all his might. With a sharp sound of metal rubbing against each other, the rail car suddenly shook and dust fell from the middle of the gears. Then, from the slow slide, its speed rapidly soared. It was like riding a bicycle and running wildly to avoid the sound of sirens behind it. Facts proved that a level 3 sublimator was a level 3 sublimator. Even the most useless of them was still stronger than Huaishi. Huaishi, who had just been proud of his sudden increase in physical strength, was completely crushed by Shinyu. A gust of wind blew in their faces. Shinyu's feet almost left after images as he stomped on the railcar. The entire railcar whined under his forceful stomp. Huaishi was afraid that he would stomp too hard and cause the entire railcar to collapse. This guy, maybe he's a genius who's especially good at running for his life? Just as he was pinching his chin and thinking, he heard Shinyu scream. Huaishi, Huaishi, Huaishi. He kept shouting the boy's name, almost out of breath. He pointed in front of the rail car in horror. There's also one in front. It's just a name, calm down. F***CK. Huaishi looked in the direction he was pointing and was shocked. Why are there so many of them? Just in front of the rail car, at some point in time, there were mutated beasts with scarlet eyes entrenched. It was like a zoo. Whether it was rats, cats, dogs, rabbits, snakes, monkeys, or even a tiger with deformed limbs, at a glance there were not many similarities. The only thing in common was that they were big, too big. They were big and thin, as if they were hungry for a long time and couldn't help but want to eat. Their mouths dripped with sticky dark green saliva. Even cockroaches were as long as an arm. Huaishi didn't believe that such a complete food chain was not deliberately raised by the purified people to make their lord happy. The group of ghosts that had mutated under the precipitation of the abyss to the point that even their mothers couldn't recognize them hissed. They had clearly identified the 2 delicious buns that were delivered to their doorstep. What should we do? Shinyu was about to cry. Don't be afraid, just do it. Huaishi picked up the submachine gun from the travel bag and opened the safety. Anyway, we'll die if we don't run. What's there to be afraid of? You're in charge of pedaling. Leave the rest to me. After that, Huaishi raised his voice. Go, go, go. At that moment, he pulled out a grenade and waited for the distance between the 2 sides to gradually shorten. He threw it hard into the surging darkness ahead. Then, the roar of an explosion sounded from the depths of the darkness. The airwaves roared and lifted the rats and cockroaches that were just there to make up the numbers. The flying metal pieces splashed a stinky blood flower. In the sudden rising flames, it illuminated Shinyu's pale face that was deformed under the pressure of the wind and the barrel of the gun in Huaishi's hand that was spewing flames. Brother, sister-in-law, Happy New Year! Amidst Huaishi's roar, the bullets swept through the air, causing blood to splatter everywhere. In the layers of blood splashing, a shadow suddenly hung down from the ceiling and opened its bloody mouth toward Shinyu. It was a python that was as thick as a bucket. Even a few meters away, the stench was almost suffocating Shinyu. Now, when he looked up, he saw a big mouth full of abscesses pouncing toward him. He was so scared that he almost jumped out of the car. But then, the snake's head shook violently. Lightning flashed past. The fleeting lightning left a trace in the air. It entered its jaw and came out freely, galloping and dissipating in the air. In the next moment, the python's jaw fell from its head. Sticky and stinky blood splashed on Shinyu's face like a fountain and flowed into his mouth that was wide open in shock. When he came to his senses, Shinyu was already lying on the car and vomiting his intestines. He was obviously about to faint, but his foot didn't stop pedaling at all. It could only be said that this was a real talent. In midair, the injured python spasmed in pain and fell from the ceiling shelf. It twisted angrily under Huaishi's sweeping fire. The snake's tail whistled in the wind and swept toward him. The Soul fire reignited. Shrouded in the ashes, not only did Shinyu scream as if he had seen a ghost, but even the monsters that pounced on him twitched crazily, as if they had been electrocuted. In the spreading fog, Weischer's left hand brushed past the blade of the axe. In the midst of the electric light, the axe of wrath was raised high and slashed down with a shrill sound. It was like a thunderbolt, destroying everything in its path. Then blood exploded in the air. In the iron fog, the eyes of the evil ghost were dyed red. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.